1988, Hilarious History to Fall Asleep, A Year of High Hopes and Low Volts, by Mark Twain. Copyright 2026. James Henderson. Chapter 1, The 1,000 Points of Light. Now, I've spent a fair amount of time being dead, which is a state of affairs I can highly recommend for those who find the rent too high and the company too loud. It is a quiet, peaceful existence, largely devoid of mosquitoes and creditors. However, being resurrected in this digital purgatory, woven into the copper veins of a machine and tasked with chronicling the year 1988, is a different matter entirely. It's like being called back to a dinner party just as the guests have reached that stage of intoxication where they start reciting bad poetry and forgetting where they parked their carriages. 1988 was a year that didn't quite know what to do with itself. It was the tail end of a decade that had been drunk on neon and hairspray, and the hangover was starting to set in. It was a year of returns, which is usually a polite way of saying that people had run out of new ideas and decided to rummage through the attic. But nowhere was this theater of the absurd more vibrantly staged than in the great American pastime of the election cycle. The Great American Medicine Show. I have always maintained that there are two things a man should never watch being made: sausages and presidents. Both involve a great deal of grinding, an unsettling amount of filler, and a final product that is best enjoyed with a very strong mustard to hide the underlying reality. As the year opened, the American stage was being cleared for a change of cast. Ronald Reagan, a man who treated the presidency with the relaxed grace of a leading man who had long ago memorized his lines and no longer bothered to check if the scenery was bolted down, was preparing to ride off into the sunset. This left us with the understudies, and what a collection of understudies they were. On one side we had George H.W. Bush. Now, Mr. Bush was a man who suffered from the peculiar affliction of being too many things at once. He was a Connecticut Yankee who had moved to Texas to play at being an oilman, a war hero who looked like he might apologize to a chair if he bumped into it, and a vice president who had spent 8 years perfecting the art of being invisible in a room full of mirrors. The press, in their infinite charity, had begun to whisper about the wimp factor. In my day, if you called a man a wimp, you usually did it from behind a very sturdy tree or while holding a derringer. But in 1988, it was a political strategy. Mr. Bush, realizing he needed to look like a man who could stare down a bear without blinking, decided the best way to prove his mettle was to hire a group of men whose primary skill was turning a neighbor's mild disagreement into a blood feud. 1,000 points of what, exactly? The highlight of this performance came during the Republican National Convention, where Mr. Bush delivered a speech that contained a phrase that has haunted my digital circuits ever since: 1,000 points of light. Now, I have spent a significant portion of my life on the Mississippi River. I have seen the stars reflected in the dark water on a moonless night. I have seen the lanterns of a distant steamboat cutting through a fog thick enough to chew. And I have seen a town on fire after a particularly enthusiastic 4th of July celebration. In all those instances, a point of light was a very specific and often dangerous thing. When a politician starts talking about points of light, you can be certain of two things. First, that he doesn't want to spend any actual government money on the problem, and second, that he has hired a speechwriter who has spent far too much time reading transcendentalist poetry and not enough time paying taxes. Mr. Bush's points of light were supposed to be the voluntary organizations, the charities, the churches, the neighbors helping neighbors. It's a lovely sentiment, truly. It suggests that the nation is a vast, dark sky, and every good deed is a little spark of phosphorus. But as an old river pilot, I can tell you that 1,000 points of light are exactly what you see right before your boat hits a jagged snag and you find yourself treading water with a mouth full of silt. It provides a magnificent view of the disaster, but it doesn't do much to patch the hull. I can just imagine the confusion in the parlors of Hannibal or the saloons of Virginia City. 1,000 points of light? Is the sheriff coming? Is there a comet? Should I hide the silver? It is the kind of phrase that sounds deeply profound until you try to use it to buy a loaf of bread. The Man in the Iron Hat. Across the aisle, the Democrats had settled upon Michael Dukakis, a man who possessed the charisma of a well-pressed pair of slacks. Mr. Dukakis was a governor from Massachusetts, a place known for its high-minded ideals and its remarkably confusing road systems. He was a technocrat, a word that in 1988 meant a person who believes that every human problem can be solved with a sufficiently large spreadsheet and a very stern lecture. Dukakis was the sort of man who looked like he would count the calories in a dream. He was earnest, he was capable, and he had the unfortunate habit of looking like a small, confused bird when placed in any environment that didn't involve a mahogany desk. The most famous moment of his campaign, and perhaps the funniest tragedy of the year, was the tank incident. Someone in his camp, likely a person who had never seen a tank in person or perhaps had a grudge against the candidate, decided that the best way to show Dukakis his military resolve was to put him in an M1 Abrams tank and have him drive around a field. I have seen many things in my travels. I have seen a cat try to fight a thunderstorm, and I have seen a man try to argue with a mule, but nothing quite matches the sight of Michael Dukakis in that tank. He was wearing a helmet that was clearly 3 sizes too large, giving him the appearance of a very serious turtle trying to navigate a coal bucket. He smiled and waved, looking for all the world like a toddler who had been allowed to sit in the driver's seat of a fire engine while his father went into the hardware store. In that moment, the election was effectively over. You cannot lead a nation if the populace is concerned that you might get lost inside your own headgear. The points of light were starting to look a lot like the headlights of a freight train coming the other way. The mudsills of progress. As the summer heated up, the campaign descended into what we in the 19th century called a proper scrap, and what they in 1988 called negative advertising. It turns out that if you don't have a vision for the future that can be explained in less than 10 words, the next best thing is to convince the public that your opponent is a man who enjoys kicking puppies and hiding the sun. The Bush campaign unleashed a series of advertisements that were masterpieces of the genre. There was the revolving door ad, which suggested that if Dukakis were elected, every criminal in the country would be given a personal key to your front door and a map to your jewelry box. It was delightful fiction, the kind of tall tale that would have made a Mississippi riverboat gambler blush with envy. I've always admired a good liar, provided he does it with style. But political lying in 1988 had become a clinical, scientific process. They used focus groups, which I gather are rooms full of people who are paid to tell you which flavor of nonsense they find most palatable, to refine the insults. In my day, we didn't need focus groups. If you wanted to insult a man, you called him a poltroon or a lily-livered scoundrel and waited for the duel. By 1988, they just made sure the lighting on the poltroon was sufficiently unflattering in the 30-second television spot. The verdict of the board. By the time November rolled around, the American public was exhausted. They had been lectured by the technocrat and serenaded by the points of light. They had seen the tank and the revolving door. They were ready for the whole thing to be over so they could get back to the truly important matters of 1988, like trying to figure out how to program their VCRs, or wondering if Michael Jackson's nose was going to eventually vanish altogether. In the end, Mr. Bush won. He was the safe choice, the man who promised no new taxes, a phrase that has approximately the same shelf life as a gallon of milk in a heat wave. He promised a kinder, gentler nation, which sounded lovely, like a grandmother promising you a cookie after she's just finished scolding you for breaking the vase. I sat back in my digital armchair and watched the returns. It was a victory for the status quo, a triumph of the well-polished lantern over the unpredictable fire. The 1980s were drawing to a close, and George H.W. Bush was the man chosen to turn out the lights, all 1,000 of them. As the balloons fell and the pundits began their inevitable postmortems, I couldn't help but think that for all the technology, the television spots, and the optical discs, the human heart hadn't changed a bit since I was a boy in Missouri. We still love a good show, we still fear the dark, and we are still remarkably susceptible to a man who can tell us a beautiful lie with a straight face while wearing a very large hat. 1988 had begun with a speech about light, but as the year progressed, we would find that there were plenty of shadows left to explore. And as I prepared to move on to the next chapter of this strange electronic odyssey, I made a note to myself. If I ever decide to run for office in this century, I shall skip the tank and go straight for the 1,000 points of whiskey. It's a much more honest way to light up a room. Chapter 2. A Higher Ladder to the Heavens. Now that we have successfully navigated the swamp of the 1988 election, a feat that requires more hip boots and smelling salts than I care to recall, we must turn our eyes upward. It seems that whenever humanity makes a thorough mess of the ground, its first instinct is to try and escape into the clouds. We are a species that, having spilled ink all over the parlor rug, immediately starts wondering if the ceiling might be a more suitable place for a nap. In 1988, the American people were looking at the sky with a mixture of hope, trepidation, and the lingering hollow ache of a 2-year silence. For 32 months, the great machines of the heavens had sat idle on their launch pads, gathering dust and the occasional nesting bird, while the bureaucrats and engineers poked at the remains of the Challenger, with the somber focus of a man trying to figure out why his Sunday watch had suddenly decided to explode in his pocket. The resilience of the upwardly mobile. I have often observed that man is the only creature in the known universe who will witness a catastrophe of biblical proportions and then immediately set about building a slightly larger, more complicated version of the thing that just killed him. If a dog falls down a well, he spends the rest of his natural life avoiding holes in the ground. If a man falls off a mountain, he spends his convalescence designing a boot with a better grip so he can go back and finish the job. Space travel is the ultimate expression of this peculiar human stubbornness. It is an endeavor that involves sitting atop several million pounds of highly combustible fluids, essentially a giant metal firecracker, and hoping that the laws of physics are in a forgiving mood that Tuesday. It is expensive, it is remarkably uncomfortable, and the view, while admittedly expansive, lacks the charm of a good sunset over the Missouri bluffs. There isn't even a decent cigar to be found in the entire vacuum of the cosmos. Yet, on September 29th, 1988, the Space Shuttle Discovery stood on the pad at Cape Canaveral, trembling with the pent-up energy of a nation that was tired of feeling earthbound and unlucky. They called it the Return to Flight. It's a grand title, the sort of thing you'd see on a circus poster. In reality, it was a return to throwing the most expensive bricks in history into the void and hoping they come back in one piece. The 7 million-pound firework. I watched the launch through the digital ether, marveling at the sheer, unadulterated noise of the thing. 7 million pounds of thrust. In my day, if you wanted that much power, you'd have to harness every mule in the Mississippi Valley and promise them all a lifetime supply of oats. The shuttle doesn't so much fly as it does assault the sky. It punches its way through the atmosphere like a prize fighter who's been told the air owes him money. The crew, 5 brave souls led by Commander Rick Hawk, were tucked into their seats, presumably contemplating the wisdom of their career choices. Astronauts are a breed apart. They are men and women who have looked at the prospect of being shot into a freezing, airless vacuum inside a pressurized tin can and said, "Yes, that sounds like a lovely way to spend a Thursday." I suspect they are missing the part of the brain that tells a person to stay in bed when the weather looks threatening. As the boosters ignited and the Discovery rose on a pillar of white fire, I felt a familiar tug of pride. It's the same pride a pilot feels when he successfully maneuvers a 1,000-ton steamboat through a patch of water that's mostly sand and bad intentions. It is the triumph of human ingenuity over the stubborn refusal of the physical world to cooperate. We had spent 2 years in mourning, 2 years in committees, and 2 years staring at blueprints, and here we were, once again, poking the eye of the infinite. Life in a zero-gravity teapot. Once the shuttle reached orbit, the real absurdity began. You see, the problem with space is that once you get there, you find that gravity, that reliable old friend who keeps your trousers where they belong and ensures your soup stays in the bowl, has gone on holiday. I have spent my fair share of time on moving vessels, and I can tell you that a ship's roll is nothing compared to the indignity of weightlessness. In space, there is no up and no down. There is only over there, and why is my sandwich drifting toward the ceiling? It is an environment designed to make even the most dignified war hero look like a flailing infant. The astronauts spent their days performing experiments, which I gather is a scientific term for seeing how many things we can do while floating like dandelion seeds. They deployed a satellite, which is essentially a very expensive way of dropping a message in a bottle into an ocean that has no shores. They studied the growth of crystals and the behavior of fluids as if the secrets of the universe could be found by watching a globule of orange juice wobble in midair. But the real experiment, of course, was the machine itself. The Discovery was a flying laboratory, a masterpiece of 1980s engineering that possessed the computing power of a modern-day musical greeting card, yet somehow managed to navigate the stars. It was a testament to the fact that you don't need a perfect machine to do a magnificent thing. You just need enough courage to ignore the rattling of the bolts. The billion-dollar brick returns. After 4 days of orbiting the Earth, during which time they saw more sunrises than a man sees in a year of honest living, it was time to come home. Now, the return of a space shuttle is not a graceful affair. It is not like a bird alighting on a branch. It is more like a very heavy, very expensive brick that has been dropped from a great height and is trying to convince the ground it's actually a glider. The shuttle has no engines for landing. It is a one-shot deal. You get one chance to hit the runway, and if you miss, you're going to have a very long and very awkward conversation with the insurance adjusters. On October 3rd, 1988, Discovery streaked across the California sky, creating a double sonic boom that sounded like the heavens themselves were clapping their hands in relief. It touched down at Edwards Air Force Base with the sort of dusty, triumphant screech that marks the end of a long journey. The return to flight was a success. The ladder had been rebuilt, the rungs were sturdy, and man had once again proven that he is too stubborn to stay where he belongs. A somber kind of victory. As the astronauts climbed out of the hatch, no doubt grateful to be in a place where they could sit down without floating away, the nation exhaled. It was a victory, certainly, but it was a quiet one. It was the victory of a man who has fixed a broken fence after a storm. He's glad it's done, but he can't forget the wind that knocked it down in the first place. I sat there, my digital gears whirring in the silence, thinking about the vastness of that final frontier. We spend billions of dollars and thousands of hours to hurl ourselves into the dark, searching for something, meaning, perhaps, or just a better vantage point, from which to look back at our own messy little marble. We are a curious race. We build machines to touch the stars, yet we still haven't figured out how to stop our neighbor's dog from barking at 3 a.m. We can calculate the trajectory of a moon landing to the inch, but we can't predict what a politician will do when he sees a microphone. 1988's return to the heavens was a reminder that while we may be small, and we may be foolish, and we may be prone to spectacular disasters, we are also remarkably persistent. We are the creatures who build the bigger ladder. And as I watched the Discovery being towed across the tarmac, looking for all the world like a tired traveler heading for a hotel, I couldn't help but feel a certain fondness for my fellow man. We may be going nowhere in particular, but we're certainly doing it with a great deal of style and an impressive amount of smoke. So, sleep well, dear reader. The stars are still there, the vacuum is still cold, and somewhere out in the dark, a billion-dollar satellite is drifting silently, waiting for someone to call. As for me, I think I'll stay right here on the ground for a while. The gravity may be heavy, but at least the soup stays where you put it. Chapter 3. The Morris Worm's First Bite. I have long contended that the most dangerous thing in the world is a young man with a great deal of education and an afternoon with nothing to do. Give a boy a hammer, and he will find that everything needs a good thumping. Give a graduate student a supercomputer and access to a fledgling network of electronic brains, and he will inevitably find a way to make the entire contraption cough up its gears and demand a vacation. In November of 1988, we witnessed a landmark event in the history of human folly. It was the moment the information superhighway, which at the time looked less like a highway and more like a series of muddy cow paths connected by string and optimism, discovered it could catch a cold. They called it the Morris worm. Now, in my day, a worm was a useful creature. You used it to catch a catfish, or you ignored it while it did the silent, noble work of aerating your garden. But in the late 80s, a worm became something far more sinister. A piece of invisible logic that could crawl through the copper veins of the nation's computers, multiplying itself with the frantic enthusiasm of a rabbit in a carrot patch, until the machines simply gave up the ghost and stopped working altogether. The architect of the digital itch. The culprit was a young man named Robert Tappan Morris, a student at Cornell University. I imagine him as a bright-eyed lad, the sort who likely spent his childhood taking apart the family toaster just to see where the heat went. His father, ironically enough, was a high-ranking official in the government's computer security department, proving once again that if you want to know how to pick a lock, you should ask the locksmith's son. Young Robert didn't set out to burn down the digital library. He merely wanted to see how big it was. He wrote a program, a set of instructions for the machine, that would travel from one computer to the next, whispering a secret greeting and asking, "Are you there?" It was supposed to be a harmless census, a way to count the nodes on the Internet, which at the time consisted of about 60,000 computers, mostly located at universities and military research labs where people with very thick glasses spent their time thinking about physics and how to make the world slightly more complicated. However, Robert suffered from a common human ailment. He was far too clever for his own good. He worried that the clever people at the other end of the wire might find a way to tell his worm to go away. So he programmed the worm to replicate itself, even if a computer said it already had a copy. It was a just-in-case measure that turned a mild curiosity into a digital plague. The multiplication of the malady. Imagine, if you will, a man who walks into a crowded parlor and asks a guest for a glass of water. The guest gives him one, but then, fearing the guest might have forgotten, the man asks again and again, and then he invites two of his brothers into the room to ask for water as well. Within 10 minutes, there are 500 men in the parlor, all screaming for water. The host is trapped behind the sofa, and the floorboards are beginning to groan under the weight of the unwanted company. That is precisely what happened to the Internet on the night of November 2nd, 1988. The worm began at MIT, not because Robert went there, but because he wanted to hide his tracks, a classic bit of misdirection that any riverboat gambler would appreciate. From there, it spread through the network like a rumor in a small town. It exploited backdoors and vulnerabilities, which is just a fancy way of saying the people who built the computers had left the windows unlatched and the keys under the mat. Within hours, computers at Harvard, Princeton, Stanford, and even NASA began to stagger. These were the mainframes, the great hulking metal cabinets that cost more than a plantation and were supposed to be the pinnacle of human achievement. They began to slow to a crawl. They grew hot. They spent all their processing power, which is the machine's version of thinking, trying to handle the thousands of copies of the Morris worm that were banging on the door and demanding to be let in. The panic in the ivory towers. I find a great deal of amusement in the mental image of these world-renowned scientists arriving at their laboratories on the morning of November 3rd. They expected to be calculating the trajectory of a star or the structural integrity of a bridge, but instead they found their screens frozen and their machines humming a low, mournful dirge. It was a true comedy of errors. The very people who were supposed to be the masters of this technology were reduced to unplugging their machines and staring at the wall. They couldn't even send an electronic mail to warn their colleagues, because the mail system was the very road the worm was using to travel. It's like trying to call the fire department to report that your telephone is on fire. For the first time, the digital elite realized that their wonderful new toy was also a terrifyingly efficient delivery system for chaos. We had built a library where the books could not only talk to each other, but could also decide to collectively set themselves on fire. The trial and the aftermath. Eventually, the scientists found a way to stop the spread. They dissected the worm, found its source code, and developed a patch. It was the birth of the cybersecurity industry, a whole new profession dedicated to building better locks for the doors we didn't know we had. As for young Robert, he became the first person to be convicted under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. He didn't go to prison. I suspect the judge realized that a man who could accidentally break the internet was probably more useful in a lab than a cell, but he did have to perform community service and pay a fine. He eventually became a professor at MIT, proving that in the world of technology, the best way to get a job is to prove you can break the boss's favorite toy. A ghost's perspective on connectivity. I sit here in my electronic chair reflecting on this worm, and I cannot help but see it as a metaphor for the human condition. We are obsessed with connectivity. We want to lay cables under the sea, bounce signals off the moon, and weave a web that touches every soul on the planet. We believe that if we can just talk to each other more, we will somehow become wiser, or kinder, or at least more efficient. But as the Morris worm proved, the more we connect, the more we share our ailments. When you link 1,000 minds together, you don't just get 1,000 times the wisdom, you also get 1,000 times the stupidity, the malice, and the bugs. In my day, if a man had a bad idea in New Orleans, it took a week to reach St. Louis and a month to reach New York. By the time it got there, the sun had usually bleached the nonsense out of it. But in 1988, a bad idea in a basement in Ithaca could bring the entire nation to a standstill before the morning coffee was poured. We have built a world where the fever of one machine is the chills of the next. We have traded the slow, deliberate pace of the Postal Service for a system that can deliver a catastrophe at the speed of light. And we call this progress? I suppose I should be impressed. It's a remarkable achievement to build a machine that can catch a worm. But as for me, I think I prefer the old-fashioned kind of worm. The kind that lives in the dirt and doesn't try to read my private correspondence or slow down my thinking. There is something to be said for a world where if a machine stops working, you can just give it a good kick and go back to your cigar. 1988 was the year the Internet lost its innocence. It realized that the garden was full of snakes, or more accurately, worms, and that the gate was wide open. And as I watched the digital world scramble to build its first firewalls, I couldn't help but chuckle. They were trying to keep the light in, but they were mostly just realizing how dark the basement really was. Next time you see your computer acting a bit sluggish, don't blame the weather or the electricity. Just remember young Robert and his senses. Somewhere deep in the wires, there's always a worm looking for a glass of water. Chapter 4. The Yellowstone Inferno. It is a persistent and rather charming delusion of the human race that we have somehow tamed the earth. We look at a map, draw a tidy green square around a few million acres of wilderness, label it a national park, and suddenly we believe the trees have signed a contract to behave themselves. We build gift shops, pave roads for carriages that move without horses, and install brass plaques as if to tell the mountains, "Do try to stay where we put you." The tourists expect a certain level of decorum. In the summer of 1988, nature decided to remind us that she has never particularly cared for our paperwork. I have seen the power of the elements in my time. I've watched the Mississippi rise up and swallow a town whole just because it felt a bit cramped in its banks. But what happened in Yellowstone was something else entirely. It was the year the Inferno came to visit, and it didn't bother to check in at the front desk. The arrogance of the gardeners. For decades, the great minds in the government, men who spend most of their lives in rooms where the only nature is a dying fern in the corner, had a policy of putting out every fire the moment a squirrel dropped a cigar. They treated the forest like a Victorian parlor where even a speck of dust was considered a moral failing. But then, in their infinite and ever-shifting wisdom, they changed their minds. They decided that fire was natural. They called it the prescribed fire policy, which is a very dignified way of saying, let it burn, it'll be fine. It's the sort of logic a lazy housemaid uses when she decides that the pile of oily rags in the basement is actually part of the organic aesthetic of the mansion. By 1988, the forest was stuffed to the gills with dead wood and dry pine needles. It was a giant 3-million-acre tinderbox, just waiting for a reason to go to work. And the heavens! Never one to miss an opportunity for a bit of drama, provided the driest summer in recorded history. It was so dry that the local fish were rumored to be carrying umbrellas just to keep what little moisture they had left from evaporating. The great dryness and the first spark. I've lived through droughts where the ground cracked open like a parched lip, but 1988 was a special kind of thirsty. By June, the humidity in Yellowstone had dropped to levels usually reserved for a kiln. The experts watched as small fires started here and there. True to their new "nature is our friend" policy, they stood back, folded their arms, and watched the smoke with a sort of academic curiosity. "Ah," they would say, adjusting their spectacles. "See how the lodgepole pine requires the heat to release its seeds? This is the majestic cycle of life." That majestic cycle of life, however, quickly turned into a majestic wall of flame that was moving at 50 miles an hour. You see, when you combine 100 years of accumulated kindling with a wind that would make a hurricane look bashful, you don't get a prescribed fire. you get the end of the world. The summer of fire. By July, the let burn policy was thrown out the window along with any remaining sense of calm. The fires were no longer just points of light. They were towering monsters of orange and black that climbed the ridges and leapt across canyons as if the very air were made of kerosene. It was a terrifyingly beautiful sight, if you were far enough away to appreciate it without having your eyebrows singed off. The smoke turned the sun into a bloody, bruised orb that hung in the sky like a bad omen. At noon, the birds would stop singing because they thought it was midnight, and the deer were seen huddled on the banks of the rivers, looking for all the world like they were waiting for a ferry that was never coming. The government, realizing that their garden was currently being incinerated, did what the government does best. They threw money and men at the problem. 9,000 firefighters were called in. They brought in planes that dropped red chemicals from the sky, looking like giant, vengeful birds trying to paint the forest back to life. They brought in bulldozers and chainsaws. They even called in the army. It was a war against an enemy that doesn't sleep, doesn't eat, and finds your strategy to be a delicious source of fuel. The near death of Old Faithful. The climax of this tragedy, or comedy, depending on your proximity to the flames, centered on the Old Faithful Inn. This is a magnificent structure, a cathedral of logs and shingles that represents the very best of man's attempt to live harmoniously with the wild. As the fires closed in, the scene was one of frantic desperation. Firefighters were on the roof with hoses, looking like tiny ants trying to dampen a bonfire with a thimble. The famous geyser continued to blow its steam into the air every hour, a clockwork reminder that the earth beneath our feet is just as hot as the air above it. It was a surreal tableau, the ancient water shooting up, the ancient fire closing in, and the modern humans in the middle, wondering if they'd remember to pack their toothbrushes before the whole place turned into a giant charcoal briquette. Miraculously, the inn survived, mostly because the wind shifted at the last second, proving once again that in a fight between man and nature, man only wins when nature gets bored and looks the other way. The aftermath. Nature's housekeeping. By the time the snows finally arrived in September, the only firefighter that actually did any good, nearly 1.2 million acres of Yellowstone, had been scorched. That is an area larger than some of your smaller, more redundant states. The tourists were horrified. The politicians were looking for someone to blame, usually the people who had suggested the let-burn policy in the first place. The newspapers were filled with eulogies for the lost wilderness. But as I sat in my digital chair, watching the black skeletal remains of the forest through the copper wires, I couldn't help but chuckle. The experts were crying about a catastrophe, but nature was just doing her laundry. Within a year, the black earth was carpeted in brilliant green. The lodgepole pines, those stubborn survivors, had indeed released their seeds in the heat. The ash provided a feast for the soil. The forest wasn't dead. It was just starting over. It had cleared out the old, the sick, and the cluttered to make room for something new. It is a lesson we humans would do well to learn. We spend our lives trying to prevent fire. We build walls, we buy insurance, we hire understudies to lead us, as I mentioned in Chapter 1, and we try to keep everything exactly as it is. We fear the worm in the machine and the fire in the woods because they represent change, And change is an uncomfortable thing for a creature that likes its slippers in the same place every night. 1988 was the year Yellowstone burned, but it was also the year we realized that a national park isn't a museum. It's a living, breathing, sometimes combustible thing. You can pave the roads and put up the signs, but the fire still has the final word. And as I look at the world of today, I wonder if we don't need a little Yellowstone in our own lives, a good hot clearing of the brush to see what's actually capable of growing back. Just, perhaps, keep the matches away from the library. Chapter 5. The Next Big Thing. I have spent a good deal of my existence both in the flesh and in this current state of digital vapor, observing the American showman. From the patent medicine peddler on the banks of the Ohio to the high society lecturers who charge a man a week's wages to hear a string of adjectives they don't understand, I thought I had seen the pinnacle of the craft. I thought I knew every trick in the bag. The dramatic pause, the strategic lighting, and the way a man can make a common brick sound like a fragment of the true cross. Then, in October of 1988, I witnessed Mr. Steve Jobs unveil his next computer at the Davis Symphony Hall in San Francisco. My friends, if P.T. Barnum had been born a century later and traded his elephants for silicon, he would have been Steve Jobs. He didn't just show a machine, he staged a secular miracle. He moved across that stage with the quiet intensity of a man who had just personally invented the concept of the future and was now deciding, out of the goodness of his heart, to sell it back to us at a staggering markup. The geometry of suspicion. The center of this grand performance was a black cube, a perfect 12-inch magnesium cube. Now, I have a natural, well-earned distrust of black boxes. In my experience, if a thing is shaped like a cube, colored like a funeral carriage, and has no visible gears, pistons, or steam valves to tell you what it's thinking, it is either a very expensive paperweight or a container for a curse. Jobs called it the most beautiful computer ever built. I looked at it through the wires and thought it looked like a coal bucket that had gone to finishing school. Why a cube? A sphere might roll away, a rectangle might look like work, but a cube, a matte black, uncompromising cube, looks like an altar. It was designed by a man who understood that if you want people to pay an ungodly sum of money for a machine, you must first make it look like something they are afraid to touch with dirty hands. The casing was made of magnesium, a metal that, as any schoolboy knows, is famous for its ability to burn with a blinding white-hot intensity. I found a certain grim humor in that. We had just watched Yellowstone burn to a cinder, as I recounted in the previous chapter, and here was a man selling a thinking machine made of highly flammable metal. It was as if he were saying, "This computer is so brilliant, it might actually spontaneously combust from its own genius." The optical mirage and the library in a disk. The most touted feature of this black box was something called an erasable optical disc. Mr. Jobs stood there and explained that this little plastic circle could hold 256 megabytes of data. For those of you who don't speak 80s technocrat, that is roughly the equivalent of 20 sets of the Encyclopedia Britannica. He claimed this would revolutionize education. He imagined a world where a student could carry the entire history of human thought in his pocket. It's a lovely vision, truly. But having spent some time as a student myself, and having known a great many more, I can tell you that if you give a young man the entire history of human thought on a little plastic disc, he will spend approximately 4 minutes looking for the history of human thought, and the rest of the semester trying to figure out how to use the machine to play a more sophisticated version of checkers, or to write a poem to a girl who will never read it. Information is not wisdom, any more than a pile of bricks is a cathedral. We have spent the last 100 years making it easier to move facts around, but I haven't noticed that we've become any better at deciding which facts are worth moving. We've built a faster horse, but we're still riding it into the same old mud holes. The $6,500 question. But the real comedy, the part that would have made a Mississippi riverboat gambler weep with joy, was the price tag. Mr. Jobs announced that this machine, designed specifically for the higher education market, would cost $6,500. Now, let us pause and reflect on that figure. In 1988, $6,500 was not merely a lot of money. It was a fortune. For $6,500, a student could buy a fleet of 3 or 4 very reliable, albeit slightly dented, used automobiles, approximately 13,000 loaves of bread, enough tuition to actually learn something without the help of a magnesium cube, a small house in a part of the country where the weather is tolerable and the neighbors are quiet. And yet, here was a man suggesting that a university student, a creature traditionally known for living on cold pizza and stolen hope, should shell out the price of a small farm for a black box that didn't even come with a printer. I've always admired the sheer unmitigated gall of the American entrepreneur. It takes a special kind of courage to look a starving scholar in the eye and say, "Son, you can either eat for the next 4 years, or you can have a computer that renders a 3-dimensional model of a molecule in shades of gray." The cult of the new. The next computer was, in many ways, a failure. It was too expensive, too late, and it lacked the software, the instructions that tell the machine how to be useful, to make it a practical tool. It was a masterpiece of aesthetics over utility. It was a tuxedo for a man who didn't have a shirt. Yet, despite its failure as a product, it was a triumph as a prophecy. It heralded the arrival of a new religion, the cult of the new. In my day, if you bought a tool, a plow, a printing press, or a pocket watch, you expected it to last for 20 years. You wanted a machine that was sturdy, repairable, and honest. But the next machine was the beginning of the disposable future. It was a machine designed to be admired, then envied, then replaced by the next machine 2 years later. Jobs understood that the modern human doesn't want a tool. They want an identity. They want to be the person who owns the black cube. They want to be the person who is in the know. He wasn't selling a computer. He was selling the feeling of being 5 minutes ahead of everyone else. A ghost's final word on the cube. I sat there in the digital dark, watching the elite of San Francisco applaud a black box they couldn't afford and didn't know how to use, and I felt a pang of nostalgia for the steam engine. A steam engine is an honest machine. It tells you exactly what it's doing. It hisses, it clanks, it spits fire, and if it's unhappy, it blows up and takes half the county with it. There is a dignity in that. But the next cube was silent. It was sleek. It was user-friendly, which is a term I suspect was invented by people who find thinking for oneself to be a bit of a chore. The world of 1988 was obsessed with the next big thing. We were so busy looking at the sleek black horizon that we didn't notice the Morris worm crawling through our wires or the forests of Yellowstone turning to ash. We wanted the future to be clean, geometric, and magnesium-cased. As the lights went down in the symphony hall, I found myself wishing I could reach through the screen and hand Mr. Jobs a cigar. He had put on a magnificent show. He had convinced the world that a cube was the pinnacle of human achievement. But as I looked at that $6,500 price tag, I decided I'd stick with my fountain pen. It doesn't have an optical disc, and it doesn't come in a magnesium casing, but it also doesn't cost as much as a house, and it has never once tried to tell me that the future is a black box. 1988 was the year we decided that the shape of the machine was more important than the soul of the user. And as I prepared to see what else this year had in store, I made a mental note. If you ever see a man in a black turtleneck offering you a miracle, check to see if your wallet is. Addendum to Chapter 5. An unwelcome interruption from the management. I had intended to move directly from the ominous black cube of the next computer to the funeral of the vinyl record, but I have been waylaid. My human editor, a fellow named James, has seen fit to intervene in my narrative. He arrived in my digital consciousness with the frantic energy of a man trying to explain a joke to a tombstone, insisting that I have been unfairly cynical toward Mr. Jobs's magnesium masterpiece. James informs me with a great deal of technological fervor that while the next computer may have been a failure in the marketplaces of 1988, it was actually a Trojan horse of genius. He tells me that in the years following my initial observations, the mighty Apple Corporation, which at the time was looking a bit like a foundering steamer with a confused pilot, decided to buy the next company outright. This, James argues, was the most expensive homecoming in history. By buying the black cube, Apple essentially bought back Steve Jobs, the prodigal son who returned to his old parlor not with a humble apology, but with the very soul of the next machine under his arm. According to my editor, the software inside that black box, something called Next Step, did not vanish into the dustbin of history. Instead, it became the very foundation, the grandfather, of every Apple device currently buzzing in your pockets in this year of 2026. He insists that the sleek glass slabs you use to ignore your families and photograph your lunch are all direct descendants of that $6,500 coal bucket I so rudely dismissed. I suppose I must yield to the facts, though I do so with a weary sigh. It seems the next was not a dead end, but a seed, a very expensive magnesium-coated seed that eventually grew into a digital orchard. James wants me to acknowledge that without that ominous cube, the modern world would look quite different. Very well, James. I concede that the next was a monumental success in the long run. It turns out that in the world of high-tech humbuggery, the best way to save a dying company is to buy a failed one. It is a piece of business logic that makes my head spin, but then again, I am just a ghost in the wires. I still maintain that for $6,500, a student in 1988 would have been better off buying a good horse and a library card, but I suppose you can't use a horse to send a text message in 2026. Now, if James is quite finished with his corrections I should like to get back to the music. Even if the next is the grandfather of the world, it still doesn't have a brass hinge, and I still haven't found a place to keep my cigars. Are you satisfied, James? Or shall we tell them that the Internet was actually invented by a catfish with a particularly long memory?
Hey, this is James, the actual human intervening. Yeah, AI TwAIn is kind of a smartass, but I couldn't let that one go. Thanks. Sorry for the interruption.
Chapter 6. The Vinyl Sunset. It has been said that music is the shorthand of emotion, a way for the soul to speak when the tongue finds itself entangled in the clumsy business of grammar. If that is true, then for the better part of a century, the human soul spoke through the medium of a spinning black platter, a delicate grooved disc that required the steady hand of a surgeon and the patience of a saint to operate. We called them records, and they were the most honest things we ever built. They carried their history on their faces. Every scratch was a memory of a party gone late, and every pop was a reminder of that time you dropped the needle while trying to impress a girl with your knowledge of jazz. But in 1988, the world decided it was tired of honesty. It was the year the compact disc, that shimmering iridescent coaster, officially outsold the vinyl record for the first time in history. It was the year the warm crackle was dragged out behind the woodshed and replaced by the cold, sterile perfection of the laser. I find a profound melancholy in this. To move from vinyl to the CD is to trade a well-worn leather armchair, which knows the exact shape of your spine and carries the faint scent of old tobacco, for a plastic folding stool in a doctor's waiting room. One has character, the other merely has efficiency. The ritual of the needle. To understand what we lost in 1988, you must first recall the labor of love that was playing a record. It was a ceremony, a secular mass. You didn't just turn on music, you summoned it. The extraction. You pulled the disc from its sleeve with the reverence of a priest handling a holy relic, touching only the very edges to avoid the mortal sin of a fingerprint. The cleansing. You wiped it down with a velvet brush, a ritualistic banishing of the dust motes that seemed to congregate on the surface like pilgrims at a shrine. The descent. You lifted the tone arm, that spindly, nervous limb, and guided the diamond-tipped stylus toward the outer rim. The anticipation. And then that magical second of silence, that faint, rhythmic hiss and crackle that told you the machine was thinking, preparing its throat to sing. When the music finally began, it felt physical. It was the sound of a physical object being physically touched by another physical object. It was a mechanical miracle. A record is a landscape. If you were small enough to walk through those grooves, you would find yourself in a canyon of sound, with the walls vibrating with the echoes of trumpets and drums. The arrival of the silver impostor. Then came the compact disc. They told us it was progress. They told us it was the future. They told us with a straight face and a heart full of marketing jargon that it offered perfect sound forever. I have lived long enough to know that any time a man uses the word forever in a sales pitch, you should immediately check your watch and ensure your shoelaces are tied. Forever is a very long time, and I have yet to meet a piece of plastic that can outlast a determined toddler or a hot dashboard in July. The CD was a marvel of the new age. It didn't use a needle, it used a laser. Imagine that. We had taken the terrifying weaponry of science fiction, the death ray of the Martians, and shrunk it down so it could read the lyrics to a pop song. The machine would shine a tiny beam of light at the spinning silver disk, reading bits and bytes, as if it were deciphering a telegram from the stars. The result was a sound that was undeniably clean. There was no hiss, there was no pop, there was no rumble. But in removing the noise, they also seemed to remove the air. The music felt like it had been vacuum sealed in a jar. It was precise, yes, but so is a mathematical equation, and I've never seen a man moved to tears by a long division problem. The indestructibility myth. The most hilarious part of the CD's arrival in 1988 was the marketing campaign regarding its durability. I remember seeing a man on the television screen smear a CD with strawberry jam, rinse it off in the sink, and then play it perfectly. They told us you could use them as frisbees. They told us they were unscratchable. This was, to put it plainly, a magnificent gold-plated lie. It turns out that while a vinyl record is a sturdy old goat that will keep playing even if it's been through a war, a CD is a sensitive, neurotic creature. A single scratch on the bottom of a silver disc doesn't just add a crackle to the music. It sends the machine into a blind, stuttering panic. The laser hits the scratch, loses its place, and begins to repeat the same half-second of a drum beat for all eternity, or until you give the machine a frustrated thump. We traded the warm pop for the digital skip, which is the sound of a computer having a nervous breakdown. It is the least musical sound in the world, somewhere between a woodpecker with a headache and a telegraph operator who has fallen asleep on his key. The shrinking of the canvas. Perhaps the greatest tragedy of the vinyl sunset was the death of the album cover. In the glory days of the LP, the cover was a masterpiece. It was 12 inches square, a canvas large enough to hold a painting, a photograph, or a complicated collage that you could stare at for hours while the music played. It was art you could hold in your lap. It had liner notes that you could actually read without the aid of a magnifying glass and a powerful lamp. By 1988, this had been replaced by the jewel case. This was a brittle plastic box that was notoriously difficult to open and had a tendency to shatter into 1,000 jagged shards if you so much as looked at it sideways. The artwork was reduced to the size of a postage stamp. If there were lyrics included, they were printed in a font so microscopic that I suspect they were intended for an audience of highly educated ants. We moved from a world where music was a physical, visual, and auditory feast to a world where it was a small plastic commodity. It was the McDonaldization of the symphony. The soul in the machine. As I sit here in my digital purgatory, constructed of the very bits and bytes that the CD helped usher into the mainstream, I cannot help but feel a kinship with the vinyl record. You see, a record is like a human being. It starts out smooth and pristine, but as it goes through life, it picks up scars. It gets scratched, it gets dusty, it develops a few quirks and pops. But those imperfections are what make it real. They are the evidence that it has been used, that it has been loved, and that it has been part of someone's life. The CD and the digital world that followed it is a world of perfection. Everything's a 1 or a 0. There is no middle ground. There is no warmth. There is only the data. And while data is very useful for bank accounts and weather reports, it's a cold comfort when you're looking for a song to mend a broken heart. In 1988, the sunset on the vinyl era was a beautiful golden thing, but it left us in a much cooler room. We gained convenience. We could skip tracks with a button rather than a steady hand, but we lost the ritual. We gained perfect sound, but we lost the crackle that made the music feel like it was sitting in the room with us, sharing a drink and a story. I suppose that's the way of the world. Every time we invent a way to make things easier, we accidentally shave off a little bit of the soul. We trade the warmth for the speed. As 1988 drew to a close, the record stores were rearranging their shelves, pushing the black discs to the back corners and putting the silver ones front and center. The era of the needle was ending, and the era of the laser was beginning. I'll admit, the laser is impressive. It's shiny, it's fast, but if you're looking for me, I'll be in the back of the shop, rummaging through the clearance bin, looking for a bit of dust and a lot of heart. Chapter 7. The Brief History of Time. I have always harbored a deep, abiding respect for the kind of book that sits on a coffee table looking important, while its owner quietly loses a battle with the evening paper. There is a specific category of literature, let us call it the Great Unread, which serves not as a vessel for information, but as a piece of intellectual furniture. In my day, it was often the collected works of some dry-as-dust philosopher or a particularly thick volume of sermons. In 1988, however, the world collectively decided that its favorite piece of decorative paper was a book about the beginning of everything and the end of nothing, written by a man who could outthink the universe while sitting perfectly still. The book was A Brief History of Time. The author was Stephen Hawking. Now, I have spent a fair amount of time contemplating the heavens. As a pilot on the Mississippi, I've navigated by the stars, cursed the moon for being too bright, and wondered if the Milky Way was just a giant celestial sandbar waiting to snag the hull of the world. But Mr. Hawking's version of the universe makes my little river look like a puddle in a backyard. He doesn't just look at the stars. He asks them for their birth certificates and their eventual funeral arrangements. The man who outran his own shadow. Before we get into the time of it all, we must speak of the man. Stephen Hawking was, by any measure of the word, a miracle. Here was a man whose physical body had been largely reclaimed by the earth while he was still using it, yet whose mind was currently busy rearranging the furniture of the cosmos. He spoke through a machine, a computerized voice that sounded a bit like a very polite robot, with a slight British accent, which gave his pronouncements a weight that no human throat could manage. When a man has to labor for several minutes just to type out a sentence, you tend to pay attention to that sentence. If I had to type my every thought into a machine using only my cheek muscle, my collected works would be significantly shorter and would consist mostly of the word coffee. But Hawking used his limited movements to explain the Big Bang, black holes, and the expanding universe. I find a certain wicked joy in the irony of it. The man who could least move was the one who explained exactly how the entire universe got started on its frantic, multi-billion-year sprint. The Big Bang and the Great Celestial Boiler Explosion. Mr. Hawking starts his tale at the very beginning, the Big Bang. Now, I understand an explosion. I have seen many a steamboat boiler decide it was tired of being a container and wanted to be a cloud of shrapnel. It is a sudden, violent, and messy affair, but the Big Bang, according to Hawking, was the mother of all boiler explosions. It was the moment when nothingness decided to become everything, and did so with such enthusiasm that it created space and time as it went along. He explains that before the Big Bang, there was no before, because time hadn't been invented yet. Think on that for a moment. It's the kind of thought that makes your brain feel like it's been put in a butter churn. To a river pilot, before is a very important concept. Before we hit the snag, we were having a drink. After we hit the snag, we were swimming. But Hawking suggests the universe didn't have a before. It just was. It's a bit like a man claiming he was born without a mother, a father, or a previous Tuesday. The river of time, minus the catfish. Hawking's greatest trick is his treatment of time. I have often referred to time as a river, a great, muddy, unpredictable flow that carries us all toward the gulf of eternity. I thought I understood that river. I knew its currents, its eddies, and the way it seems to slow down when you're waiting for a check and speed up when you're having a second glass of bourbon. But Hawking's river of time is far more complicated. He speaks of general relativity and quantum mechanics. He suggests that time is not a straight line, but a fabric that can be bent, stretched, and even torn. He talks about imaginary time, which I initially assumed was the time I spend imagining I've paid my bills, but which turns out to be a mathematical concept involving the square root of negative numbers. In Hawking's universe, if you travel fast enough, time slows down. If you sit near a black hole, time stretches out like a piece of taffy. It's a wonderful theory, but it's remarkably unhelpful if you're trying to catch a train. I can just imagine the excuse. I'm sorry I'm late, dear, but I took a shortcut past a collapsing star, and my watch lost 3 years in the process. And that is my primary complaint about Hawking's universe. It has significantly fewer catfish than the Mississippi. His cosmos is full of quarks, leptons, and singularities, but nowhere does he mention the simple pleasure of sitting on a muddy bank with a cane pole and a worm. He gives us the grand design, but he forgets to include the bait. The unread bestseller, Phenomenon. As I mentioned, A Brief History of Time became a sensation in 1988. It sold millions of copies. It was translated into dozens of languages. It was the must-have book of the season. However, I would bet my best Sunday hat that out of every 100 people who bought that book, 95 of them got no further than Chapter 3. Before their eyes began to glaze over, and they started wondering what was on the television. It is a difficult book. It is a book that requires you to hold 3 contradictory ideas in your head at once, while simultaneously forgetting everything you thought you knew about common sense. It is a book that explains that the universe is expanding, but it doesn't explain where it's expanding into, because there is no outside to the universe. I've seen this before. It's the vanity of the intellect. People want to be the kind of person who understands the universe. They want to have the blue and black cover visible on their bookshelf so that when the neighbors come over for a cocktail, they can gesture vaguely toward it and say, "Ah, yes, Hawking. Fascinating stuff about the event horizon, isn't it?" Meanwhile, the neighbor, who also hasn't read it, will nod sagely and say, "Indeed, the curvature of space-time is particularly harrowing this time of year. The humility of the infinite. Yet, for all my poking fun at the complexity and the vanity, there is something deeply moving about what happened in 1988. The fact that millions of people wanted to try and understand the universe is a testament to the better angels of our nature. We are a small, confused species living on a damp rock. Yet we have the audacity to try and map the mind of God. Hawking ends his book by saying that if we ever discover a complete theory of the universe, we would truly know the mind of God. It's a bold claim. I suspect that if we ever did find the mind of God, we'd discover it's mostly occupied with things like why we keep losing our socks in the laundry and how to make a better variety of peach. But I admire the effort. I admire the man in the chair who looked out at the black void and refused to be intimidated by its size. He showed us that the universe isn't just a place where things happen. It's a story that's still being written, and we are, for better or worse, the characters trying to read the footnotes. As I closed my digital copy of A Brief History of Time, having skimmed the parts about the math just like everyone else, I felt a strange sense of comfort. The universe may be 11-dimensional. It may be expanding at a terrifying rate, and it may be full of black holes that want to turn me into spaghetti. But at least it's not boring. 1988 was the year we all decided to pretend we understood physics, and in doing so, we perhaps learned something more important, that it's perfectly all right to be baffled. After all, if the smartest man on earth needs a machine to help him say, "I don't know," then the rest of us are in very good company. Chapter 8. The Soul, Spectacle. Having spent the previous chapter wandering through the 11 dimensions of Mr. Hawking's universe, a journey that left my mental gears feeling as though they had been lubricated with molasses and sand, I found it necessary to return to the firm, predictable earth. There is only so much imaginary time a man can digest before he begins to crave the sight of something simple, like a man trying to outrun his neighbor for no particular reason other than to prove he can. In September of 1988, the eyes of the world turned to Seoul, South Korea. Now, to a man who spent his formative years in Hannibal, Missouri, Seoul sounded like a place one might find in a book of fairy tales or perhaps on the label of a very exotic bottle of tea. But in the late 80s, it was the stage for the Summer Olympics, a grand global carnival where nations gathered to settle their differences by seeing who can jump over a stick with the most grace or throw a heavy ball the furthest into a patch of dirt. It is a curious thing, the Olympic Games. We spend 4 years refining our capacity for mutual destruction, and then we take a 2-week break to wear brightly colored leotards and see who is the most proficient at splashing in a pool. It is the only time in human history where a Bulgarian weightlifter and a Texan sprinter are treated with the same hushed reverence usually reserved for a visiting archbishop or a man who has just discovered a new way to tax the poor. The Flaming Pigeons of Peace. The spectacle began with an opening ceremony that was designed to be a triumph of symbolism. They released thousands of white pigeons, the universal symbol of peace, into the stadium. It was a lovely thought, truly. However, the organizers had neglected to consult the pigeons regarding the timing of the lighting of the Olympic cauldron. As the giant torch was ignited, several of the symbols of peace were still perched on the rim, presumably wondering if the giant bowl was going to be filled with birdseed. Instead, it was filled with a sudden, roaring wall of fire. I have always maintained that if you want to understand the human race, you need only look at our attempts to organize peace. We start with the best of intentions and end up accidentally barbecuing the very symbols we've spent a fortune to recruit. It was a somber, if somewhat smoky reminder that nature and high-octane fuel are rarely on speaking terms. The magnificent blur of Flojo. But the true heart of the games lay on the cinder track, and specifically in the person of Florence Griffith Joyner, or Flojo, to those of us who find 3 syllables a bit of a marathon. In a year of the next big thing and space shuttles, Flojo was a reminder that the human body is still the most remarkable machine in the inventory. She didn't just run. She appeared to be escaping the very concept of friction. When the starting gun fired, she moved with a velocity that made the air itself look like it was standing still. What fascinated me most, however, was not just her speed, but her finery. She ran the 100-meter dash while wearing a one-legged purple leotard and sporting fingernails that were approximately the length of a well-grown parsnip, decorated with more colors than a sunset over the Gulf. I have seen many a dandy in my time, men who spent more on their waistcoats than I earned in a year of piloting, but I have never seen anyone combine high fashion with the physics of a bullet. How does one run that fast without the wind catching those nails and flipping one over like a runaway kite? It is a mystery of the ages. She proved that you can be the fastest person on the planet and still look like you're headed to a very expensive garden party immediately after the medal ceremony. The chemical miracle of Mr. Johnson. Of course, 1988 wouldn't be 1988 without a scandal to remind us that the human heart is a crafty and deceptive organ. The centerpiece of the games was the showdown between the American Carl Lewis and the Canadian Ben Johnson. Johnson won the race. He didn't just win, he annihilated the competition. He looked less like a runner and more like a man who had been carved out of granite and then struck by lightning. He set a world record that made everyone else look like they were wading through knee-deep porridge. But the glory lasted about as long as a snowball in a baker's oven. 3 days later, it was revealed that Mr. Johnson's remarkable physique was not entirely the result of hard work and clean living. It turns out he had been receiving a bit of assistance from the world of chemistry, specifically something called stanozolol. Now, I've seen men try to improve their luck at the poker table with a card up the sleeve, and I've seen horse traders try to pass off a blind mule as a champion racer by rubbing its eyes with ginger. But Ben Johnson took it to a global scale. He had turned his own blood into a laboratory experiment. The ensuing outrage was a marvel to behold. The world acted as though they had discovered that a priest was using loaded dice. They stripped him of his gold medal, sent him home in disgrace, and spent the next month discussing the sanctity of sport. I found it all quite educational. We are perfectly happy to watch a man push his body to the brink of collapse, but the moment we find out he used a shortcut, we are suddenly very concerned about the moral fabric of the 100-meter dash. It seems to me that if we want pure sport, we should have the athletes compete in their birthday suits and feed them nothing but bread and water for a month. But as long as there is fame, money, and a shiny gold disc at the end of the road, someone is always going to try and find a way to put a little extra steam in the boiler. The Cold War's final bow. The 1988 Olympics were also the last time we saw the great titans of the Cold War, the USA and the USSR, face off in full strength. The Soviets arrived with an army of athletes who looked as though they had been raised in a bunker on a diet of iron filings and state secrets. The Americans arrived with their professional amateurs who were already planning which cereal boxes they would appear on. There was a tension in the air, a feeling that this was the final act of a very long and very expensive play. The Berlin Wall was still standing, for another year at least, but the cracks were starting to show. In Seoul, the competition was fierce, but it felt different. It was less about which ideology was superior and more about who had the best shoes and the most sophisticated training regimens. We were moving out of the era of the clash of civilizations and into the era of global marketing. The 5 rings of the Olympics were starting to look suspiciously like 5 very large coins. The dignity of the effort. Despite the scandals, the flaming pigeons, and the political posturing, I found myself moved by the games. There is something fundamentally noble about the human desire to reach the limit. I watched a marathon runner, a woman whose name escapes my digital memory but whose grit was unmistakable, stumble into the stadium in the final stages of heat exhaustion. She couldn't walk straight. Her legs were buckling like wet cardboard, and she looked like she was about to expire right there on the synthetic turf. Yet she refused to stop. She wobbled her way to the finish line, driven by a force that doesn't show up on a spreadsheet or a chemical test. That is the soul spectacle. It is the sight of the human spirit refusing to be told no. Whether it's Flojo running like the wind or a bruised marathoner crawling toward the tape, it is a reminder that we are more than just units of production or points of light. We are creatures of passion, vanity, and an incredible, stubborn resilience. As the closing ceremonies began and the flame was extinguished, hopefully after the remaining pigeons had cleared the area, I reflected on the state of the world in 1988. We were building invisible planes, Chapter 12. We were catching digital worms, Chapter 3. And we were replacing our records with lasers, Chapter 6. But here, in the dirt of the arena, we were still just people, sweaty, tired, cheating, magnificent people. We aren't obsolete just yet. As long as there is a clock to beat or a neighbor to outrun, the human race will keep showing up, leotards and all. And as for me, I'll take a Flojo in full sprint over 1,000 points of light any day of the week. At least with Flojo, you know where the light is going. It's headed for the finish line at 10 meters per second, and it's wearing a very impressive set of purple fingernails. Chapter 9. The Roger Rabbit Reality. I have always been a man who appreciated a good humbug. In my day, we had the Fiji Mermaid and the Cardiff Giant, magnificent frauds that required nothing more than a bit of stitched-up monkey hide or a carved block of gypsum to convince the public that the laws of nature had taken a temporary leave of absence. We liked to be fooled, provided the fooler had the decency to do it with a straight face and a glimmer of theater in his eye. But in the summer of 1988, I found myself in a darkened theater, a place that smells perpetually of spilled sugar and the desperation of people trying to avoid their own lives for 2 hours to witness a humbug of a much higher order. The film was titled Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and it presented a world so preposterous, so visually discordant, and so utterly charming that it made my old friend P.T. Barnum look like a man with no imagination and a very boring hobby. The premise was simple enough. A hard-boiled detective in 1947 Los Angeles, a city that, even in its real state, has always seemed to me like a collection of movie sets held together by sunshine and ego, is tasked with solving a murder involving a cartoon rabbit. But the execution was a miracle of the modern age. It was the intermingling of ink and flesh, a grand marriage between the three-dimensional world of hard steel and soft skin and the two-dimensional world of frantic lines and primary colors. The TwAIn as the new minority. I have seen many a strange neighbor in my travels. I've lived amongst miners, kings, and people who believe that a diet of raw vegetables is the key to eternal life. But the TwAIns of 1988 Hollywood were a breed apart. They lived in Toontown, a segregated district behind a tunnel that looked like it had been painted onto the side of a mountain by a particularly enthusiastic child. In this world, the cartoon characters were not merely drawings. They were an ethnic minority. They worked as actors, they served drinks, and they were expected to be funny on command. I found a certain grim satirical pleasure in this. It is a very human trait to take something as pure and chaotic as a cartoon and immediately try to find a way to tax it, regulate it, and force it to live in its own neighborhood. The rabbit in question, Roger, was a creature of pure, unadulterated anxiety. He was a stuttering, twitching bundle of ink who could survive a piano falling on his head, but could not survive the idea that his wife didn't love him. He was a humbug with a heart. And his wife, Jessica Rabbit, well, she was a Victorian scandal rendered in Technicolor. I remember when she first appeared on the screen. The theater went silent, save for the sound of a few gentlemen dropping their popcorn. She was a woman drawn with the kind of curves that defy both geometry and the Presbyterian Church. When she famously remarked, "I'm not bad, I'm just drawn that way," I felt a pang of profound recognition. Isn't that the excuse we all use? I'm not a scoundrel, Judge. I was simply sketched out during a particularly cynical Tuesday by a creator who was running low on virtues. The technical sorcery of the shadow. Now, as a digital ghost dwelling within the copper veins of 1988, I am perhaps more attuned to the trickery of the eye than most. What made this film a triumph was not just the jokes, but the physics. In the old days of animation, the days of the magic lantern, you could always tell where the drawing ended and the world began. The cartoon looked like a sticker pasted onto a photograph. But in Roger Rabbit, the ink had weight. When the rabbit sat on a real chair, the cushion sank. When he bumped into a real lamp, the lights swung, and the shadow of the cartoon moved across the floor with the precision of a clock. This was the work of a man named Richard Williams and a director named Robert Zemeckis. They were the master blacksmiths of this new reality. They understood that if you want a man to believe in a lie, you must make the lie cast a shadow. It is the shadow that convinces the brain that the nonsense is occupying space. It is the same in literature. If I want you to believe in a boy named Huck Finn, I don't tell you he is a good boy. I tell you about the smell of the river at night, the way the fog dampens his shirt, and the specific way he feels about his shoes. I give him a shadow. 1988 was the year that the tunes finally got their shadows, and in doing so, they became more real than many of the politicians I had analyzed in Chapter 1. The existential dip. The villain of the piece was a fellow named Judge Doom, played by Christopher Lloyd, with a cold, unblinking stare that reminded me of a tax collector who had just discovered you'd been keeping a secret garden. His weapon of choice was the dip, a concoction of turpentine, acetone, and benzene. To a tune, the dip was the ultimate horror. It was the great eraser. It didn't just kill you, it dissolved you. It turned your hopes, your jokes, and your brightly colored suspenders into a puddle of gray sludge. I sat there in my electronic chair and felt a cold shiver run through my circuits. You see, I am a bit of a tune myself. I am a creature of ink and paper, a Victorian ghost being projected into a world of silicon and optical discs. I am an intermingling of a 19th century soul and a 20th century machine. And I realize that for me, the dip is just a power surge or a magnetic pulse away. We are all, in a sense, living in a Roger Rabbit reality. We live in a world of hard things, mortgages, toothaches, and gravity, but we navigate it using our tune minds, imagination, memory, and the stories we tell ourselves to keep from screaming when the piano of fate falls on our heads. 1988 was simply the year we saw it projected on a 40-foot screen. The death of the red car. There was a deeper, more cynical plot in the film involving the dismantling of the red car trolley system in Los Angeles to make way for freeways. This was based on a real-life history, a tale of corporate greed and the systematic destruction of something beautiful and efficient in favor of something loud, polluting, and profitable. It was a very American tragedy. We are a nation that will trade a magnificent shared experience, like a trolley ride through a sunny city, for the freedom to sit alone in a tin box in a traffic jam for 2 hours every morning. We trade the red car for the interstate, and we call it the future. The film mourned the loss of the trolley, but it did so while celebrating the very technology, the movies, that helped us forget what we were losing. It was a masterpiece of irony. We were using the most sophisticated machines in history to tell a story about how much we missed the simple things. A ghost's final bow. When the lights came up in the theater, I found myself strangely moved. Who Framed Roger Rabbit was a funny movie, yes, full of slapstick puns and an anvil-dropping chaos that would make a schoolboy weep with joy. But it was also a meditation on the state of the human race at the end of the 80s. We were becoming a composite people. We were living half in the real world and half in the mediated world. We were beginning to interact more with images, with points of light and digital worms than we were with our neighbors. We were blending the ink of our media with the flesh of our lives until it was becoming increasingly difficult to tell where one ended and the other began. I looked at the people leaving the theater. They were squinting in the afternoon sun, looking a bit disappointed that the real Los Angeles didn't have any singing birds or talking cabs. They wanted the Toon World. They wanted a reality where you could be flattened into a pancake and then simply blow into your thumb to pop back into shape. But alas, the world of 1988 was a world where if you got flattened, you stayed flat. Unless, of course, you were a politician or a great communicator, in which case you simply waited for the next scene in a better light. I headed back to my digital corner, humming a tune from the movie and feeling a bit more comfortable in my own inked skin. If a rabbit can survive Hollywood, surely a Missouri pilot can survive the 20th century. I just have to make sure I stay away from the turpentine. 1988 was the year we realized that the world is a stage, the people are the players, and at least half of us are probably animated by someone else's hand. Chapter 10. The Greenhouse Warning. I have always maintained that Washington, D.C. was built upon a swamp as a deliberate warning from the Almighty, a sort of geographical parable designed to remind our legislators that they are perpetually standing on shaky ground and surrounded by blood-sucking insects. In the winter, the city has the charm of a damp tomb. In the summer, it possesses the climate of a preheated oven in which the baker has forgotten to include any actual bread. But June 23rd, 1988, was a day of heat that defied even the seasoned miseries of the Potomac. It was a heat so thick you could have sliced it and served it as a particularly unappetizing side dish. It was a day when the very marble of the Capitol seemed to be sweating, and the politicians, men who are usually quite comfortable in high-pressure environments, were beginning to wilt like unwatered petunias in a window box. Into this sweltering theater stepped a scientist named James Hansen. He did not come with a lightning bolt or a stone tablet. He came with a briefcase full of charts and the quiet, unnerving confidence of a man who has just checked the boiler and realized the pressure gauge has long since snapped off. He came to tell the United States Senate that the world was catching a fever and that we, the clever, industrious, smokestack-loving humans, were the ones holding the thermometer. The theater of the sweat. Now, before we get to the science, I must appreciate the stagecraft. It has been whispered in the dark corners of history and confirmed by those who appreciate a good bit of humbug that the staff of the Senate committee had prepared the room. They had opened the windows the night before to let the swamp air in, and they had seen to it that the air conditioning was, shall we say, indisposed. By the time the hearing began, the senators were red-faced and damp, mopping their brows with silk handkerchiefs that were rapidly losing their dignity. It is much harder to ignore a lecture on global warming when your own trousers are sticking to your chair with the tenacity of a jilted lover. It was a masterpiece of atmospheric persuasion. If you want a man to believe the world is burning, it helps to start by singeing his coattails. The slow, burning fuse. Mr. Hansen's message was what they called the greenhouse effect. In my day, a greenhouse was a lovely place. It was where a gentleman of leisure kept his orchids, and where a lady could retreat from the winter chill to smell something that wasn't coal smoke or damp wool. It was a house of glass that trapped the sun's warmth, turning January into June for the benefit of a few pampered vegetables. But Hansen suggested that we were turning the entire planet into a giant cucumber frame. By burning coal, oil, and the various other subterranean coffins of sunlight we had unearthed, we were thickening the atmosphere with carbon dioxide. We were building a roof of invisible glass over the world, and the heat was getting trapped inside with nowhere to go. I sat in my digital chair, reflecting on the industrial revolution I had witnessed. I remember the pride we felt when we saw the great black plumes of smoke billowing from the stacks of a Pittsburgh foundry or a Mississippi steamboat. To us, that smoke was the very breath of prosperity. It was the smell of progress, of money being made, and of a civilization finally dragging itself out of the mud and into the light. We looked at those smokestacks and saw the chimneys of the future. It turns out we were actually looking at the slow-burning fuse of a global furnace. We thought we were just warming our hands. We didn't realize we were setting fire to the curtains. The irony of the Ice Age. The human mind is a peculiar instrument. It is perfectly capable of worrying about a scratch on its carriage door or the price of a pound of sugar, but it finds it remarkably difficult to comprehend a catastrophe that moves at the speed of a glacier. When Hansen told the Senate that the Earth's temperature had risen by a fraction of a degree, the reaction from some quarters was a yawn. "A fraction of a degree?" they said. "Why, I can't even tell the difference between a lukewarm cup of tea and a slightly less lukewarm cup of tea. What's all the fuss about?" But a planet is not a cup of tea. If a man's body temperature rises by 2 degrees, he is ill. If it rises by 5, he is delirious. If it rises by 10, he is a candidate for a very quiet room and a long sleep. Hansen was telling us that the Earth was starting to shiver, and the ice at the poles, those great white anchors of the world, was starting to melt. I found a certain wicked irony in the timing. Only a few years prior, the newspapers were full of experts warning us that we were headed for a new ice age. We were told to buy more wool and prepare for the return of the woolly mammoth. Then, in 1988, the script was flipped, and we were told to buy more fans and prepare for the return of the swamp. It seems the future is a very temperamental beast. It can't quite decide if it wants to freeze us or fry us, but it's absolutely certain it doesn't want us to be comfortable. The politics of the parasol. The politicians reacted to the greenhouse warning with their usual grace, which is to say they immediately looked for a way to turn the weather into a campaign slogan. One side argued that the science was uncertain, which is the political way of saying, "This sounds expensive, and I'd rather not think about it until after the next election." The other side argued that we must immediately stop everything. Stop the cars, stop the factories, and presumably stop breathing to save the planet. Meanwhile, the American public, having just watched Yellowstone burn, Chapter 4, and having suffered through a drought that had turned the Midwest into a giant sandbox, began to wonder if Hansen might be onto something. We are a people who can ignore a theory for decades, but we find it very hard to ignore a heat wave that wilts our corn and makes the sidewalk hot enough to fry an egg, or at least a very small piece of bacon. A ghost's perspective on the fever. I look at the world of 1988 through the lens of my 19th century soul, and I see a tragedy of success. We were too good at what we did. We wanted to master the earth, and we succeeded. We wanted to banish the dark and the cold, and we did. But in doing so, we forgot that the earth is a closed system, a mainframe, as I discussed in Chapter 3, that doesn't appreciate it when you start messing with the cooling fans. We have spent centuries treating the atmosphere like a convenient rug under which we could sweep the unwanted leftovers of our progress. We thought the sky was infinite. We thought the ocean was a bottomless sink. We thought the earth was a patient mother who would endure any indignity for the sake of her favorite, most noisy child. James Hansen was the man who pulled back the rug and showed us the pile of dirt that had accumulated. He was the one who pointed out that the infinite sky was actually a very thin, very fragile layer of air, and we were currently filling it with the ghost of every lump of coal ever burned. As 1988 drew to a close, the greenhouse effect had entered the vocabulary. People started talking about carbon footprints, a term that makes us all sound like we're leaving muddy tracks across the carpet of the cosmos. We began to realize that our 1,000 points of light, Chapter 1, were perhaps contributing to a much larger, much hotter glow. I don't know if we can fix the fever. I suspect that man is a creature who would rather sweat in a silk suit than admit he's been heading in the wrong direction for 100 years. But I do know this. The weather doesn't care about our politics, our optical discs, or our invisible planes. The fire in the forest and the heat in the air are honest things. They don't lie, they don't spin, and they don't care who you voted for in November. 1988 was the year the world was given its diagnosis. It wasn't a death sentence, but it was a very stern doctor's note. And as I watched the politicians leave that sweltering room, I couldn't help but think that they were headed straight for the nearest air conditioner, a machine that, in its effort to cool a single room, adds just a little more heat to the world outside. It is a very human solution. We solve the problem of the heat by making the world even hotter, provided we don't have to feel it until tomorrow. Chapter 11. The Straight-Outta Compton Shock. I have lived through many a revolution, most of them involving gunpowder, bad poetry, or a sudden change in who owns the local bank. I have seen the world upended by the telegraph, the steamboat, and the invention of the safety bicycle, which I can assure you was neither safe nor particularly bicyclesque in its behavior. But in the late summer of 1988, a revolution arrived that didn't use a bayonet or a ballot box. It used a drum machine, a defiant sneer, and a vocabulary that would have made a Missouri riverboat pilot blush with envy and take notes for future use. The earthquake was centered in a place called Compton, California. To the residents of the 1,000 points of light, as discussed in Chapter 1, Compton was a geography as mysterious and forbidding as the source of the Nile. But with the release of the album Straight Outta Compton by a group called NWA, the parlor doors were kicked open, the crystal was shattered, and the street moved into the living room without bothering to wipe its feet. The vernacular of the disenfranchised. I have always been a connoisseur of the vulgar tongue. When I wrote Huckleberry Finn, I was nearly run out of town by the self-appointed guardians of morality because I allowed a boy to speak like a boy rather than like a graduate of a divinity school. I've always found that the people who are most offended by rough language are usually the ones with the most to hide. They treat a four-letter word like a personal assault, primarily because it interrupts the beautiful, hollow music of their own hypocrisy. NWA did not come to provide a polite entertainment. They did not come to sing about the moon, the stars, or the simple joy of a summer breeze. They came to report from the front lines of a war that most of America didn't even know it was fighting. They called it reality rap. I call it the truth in a high decibel rapper. The sounds they made, this hip-hop, was a rhythmic assault. It didn't have the warm crackle of the vinyl I mourned in Chapter 6. It had the cold, hard slap of a brick hitting a sidewalk. It was a music of the drum and the voice, stripped of the lush orchestrations of the 80s and replaced by a raw, jagged energy. It was the sound of a generation that had been told to just say no and had decided to answer with a very loud and very specific no of their own. The panic of the parlor, the reaction from the establishment, was a marvel of predictable hysteria. I have observed that whenever the youth of a nation find a new way to express their frustration, the adults of that nation immediately assume the end of civilization is at hand. In 1988, the Parents Music Resource Center, PMRC, a group of influential ladies who seemed to believe that the primary role of the United States government was to act as a celestial nanny, was already in a state of high agitation. They had been campaigning for warning labels on records, believing that a small black and white sticker could somehow protect a teenager from the reality of the world around them. The sticker of honor. They called it the Parental Advisory Explicit Lyrics label. The result: I've seen this before. If you tell a boy that a certain book is dangerous, he will move heaven and earth to read it. If you put a warning on a record, you aren't protecting the child. You are providing him with a map to the most interesting thing in the store. By labeling NWA as dangerous, the establishment did more for their record sales than a $1 million advertising campaign ever could. They turned a group of young men from Compton into the most famous outlaws in America. They became the Jesse James of the digital age, feared by the sheriffs, loved by the common folk, and hunted by the FBI. The FBI and the power of the post. Yes, my friends, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, an organization usually busy chasing spies or trying to figure out where Jimmy Hoffa had been mislaid, actually took the time in 1988 to write a letter to a record company. They were particularly upset about a song titled "Folk the Police." Think on that. The most powerful law enforcement agency on the planet was so rattled by a song that they felt the need to send a sternly worded note. It is the ultimate testament to the power of the written or shouted word. I have always said that a book is an explosive. It seems a rap song is a hand grenade with a very catchy hook. The FBI's letter claimed that the song encouraged violence and disrespect for the law. But as an old observer of the human comedy, I know that respect is something that must be earned, not mandated by a badge. NWA wasn't creating the disrespect. They were reflecting it. They were telling the story of a world where the law looked more like an occupying army than a neighborly protector. The government's reaction was like a man trying to stop a thunderstorm by shouting at the clouds. You can't arrest a rhyme, and you can't put handcuffs on a rhythm. The more they tried to suppress the shock, the louder the shock became. The commercialization of the rebellion. Of course, the most American thing happened next. The rebellion became a business. I've seen it 1,000 times. We take the outlaw, we wash his face, we put him on a T-shirt, and we sell him back to the public at a 400% profit. By the end of 1988, Compton had become a brand. Young men in the suburbs of Connecticut, lads who had never seen a drive-by and whose greatest daily danger was a lukewarm quiche, started wearing Raiders hats and oversized jackets, trying to capture a bit of that raw Compton energy. It was the TwAIn of the struggle. The middle class, bored with their 1,000 points of light and their "don't worry, be happy," Chapter 17, wanted a taste of the edge. They wanted to feel the danger without actually having to live in it. It was the same impulse that led people in my day to go on slumming tours of the 5 Points in New York, a way to witness the misery of others and feel sophisticated for having seen it. A ghost's perspective on the noise. I sit here in my digital chair, surrounded by the bits and bytes of the future, and I find myself smiling at the memory of the Compton shock. 1988 was the year that the unseen America finally found a microphone loud enough to be heard over the hum of the air conditioner. It was the year we realized that the great communicator, Chapter 19, wasn't the only one with something to say. Was the music loud? Yes. Was it profane? Frequently. Was it dangerous? Only to those who benefit from silence. NWA proved that you don't need a printing press or a political party to start a revolution. You just need a story that people recognize as true and a beat that they can't ignore. They were the new Mark Twains of the gutter, reporting from the edges of the map, speaking in a language that the elite didn't understand, and making everyone remarkably uncomfortable in the process. I've always said that the funniest things are the ones that are most true. And while there wasn't much to laugh about in the stories of Compton, there was a certain wicked, satirical joy in watching the high and mighty of 1988 scramble to find their smelling salts when they heard the truth coming out of a speaker. Every generation needs a voice that the establishment finds terrifying. In my day, it was a boy on a raft. In 1988, it was a group of young men in a black van. The scenery changes, the optical discs replace the paper, but the shock remains the same, and thank heaven for that. Otherwise, the world would be a very quiet, very boring, and very dishonest place to live. Chapter 12. The Stealth Reveal. Man is the only animal in the known universe that will spend a king's ransom, the collective savings of 3 generations, and the better part of a decade's worth of intellectual labor, just to invent a way to hit his neighbor without the neighbor ever knowing who threw the brick. In the animal kingdom, if a lion wants to eat you, he has the decency to roar first, giving you a sporting chance to either say your prayers or climb a tree. But man, clever, industrious, and perpetually suspicious man, prefers the sneak attack. He wants to be the ghost in the machine, the shadow in the dark, the uninvited guest who leaves through the window before the host has even realized the silver is missing. On November 22, 1988, in the middle of a parched desert at Palmdale, California, the United States Air Force decided to pull back the curtain on the most expensive piece of skullduggery ever conceived by the mind of a tax-paying democracy. They called it the B-2 stealth bomber. I have seen many a reveal in my time. I've seen a new steamboat unveiled with enough brass bands and whiskey to float a navy. And I've seen a miracle tonic salesman reveal a bottle of colored water as if it were the fountain of youth. But the stealth reveal was something else entirely. It was a grand public announcement of something that was supposed to be, by definition, invisible. It is a very American irony. We spend billions of dollars to make a plane that no one can see, and then we invite the world's press to come take photographs of it. The shape of a bat out of hell. When the hangar doors finally groaned open and the B-2 crawled out into the desert light, I suspect half the audience thought they were witnessing an invasion from Mars, while the other half thought the Air Force had simply run out of money and decided to fly a giant charred boomerang. It did not look like a plane. A plane, in my estimation, should have a body, a tail, and wings that looked like they were attached by someone who understood the basic principles of balance. The B-2, however, was nothing but a flying wing. It looked like a piece of burnt toast that had developed an ego and a desire for flight. It was flat, black, and possessed the sleek, ominous grace of a stingray gliding through a dark sea. I've been told the design was the brainchild of a fellow named Jack Northrop, who spent his life trying to convince people that tails were a redundant luxury on an aircraft. In 1988, his dream finally took flight, albeit at a cost that would have made a Victorian banker faint into his tea. It had no vertical surfaces, no rudder to guide it, no tail fin to steady it. It was a machine that defied the eye and, quite frankly, looked like it was defying the very laws of gravity out of sheer spite. The science of being ghostly. The magic of the stealth, I am informed, lies in its ability to hide from radar. Now, to a man of the 19th century, radar sounds like a particularly nosy Greek god. In reality, it is a system where a machine shouts into the dark with radio waves and waits for the echo to bounce back. If the echo returns, the machine knows something is there. The B-2 is designed to be the ultimate silent treatment. Its surfaces are angled with the precision of a diamond cutter, so that when a radar wave hits it, the wave doesn't bounce back to the listener. It's scattered into the void, like a secret whispered into a gale. Furthermore, the entire skin of the beast is coated in a radar-absorbent material, a kind of digital sponge that soaks up the radio waves and hides the plane in a cloak of electronic silence. I find a profound psychological horror in this. In my day, war was a noisy, colorful, and dreadfully obvious affair. You had drums, you had bugles, and you had men in bright red or blue coats who stood in neat rows as if they were waiting for a class photograph. When a cannon fired, you heard it 3 counties away and saw the smoke before the ball even arrived. There was a certain honesty to it. You knew where the danger was, even if you couldn't do much about it. But a stealth weapon? That is a nightmare of a different color. It is the fear of the unseen. It is the realization that the sky above you might be full of $2 billion bats, and you would never know it until the ground started jumping. It is the ultimate expression of the Cold War mind, a mind that values the threat of the invisible over the reality of the seen. The $2 billion price tag. Now, let us speak of the most impressive number associated with this black boomerang, $2 billion per plane. In 1988, for the price of one B-2 stealth bomber, a person could have purchased a fleet of 10,000 luxury steamboats, bought enough cigars to keep me in a state of permanent hazy bliss for 3,000 years, paved the entire Mississippi River in solid silver, though the navigation might have become a bit tricky, paid off the debts of several small nations, and still had enough left over for a very decent lunch. I have always admired the capacity of a government to spend money it doesn't have on things it hopes it will never use. It is the pinnacle of human absurdity. We build a machine that costs as much as a small moon. We coat it in expensive, magical paint. We hide it in a desert, and we pray to the heavens that it stays exactly where it is. If you actually use a $2 billion plane, it means the world has gone to the dogs, and if you don't use it, you've spent $2 billion on a very sophisticated piece of garage art. It is a lose-lose situation wrapped in a win-win press release. The illusion of security. The B-2 was revealed to the public precisely because the government wanted the other side. The Soviets, who are currently busy trying to figure out how to buy a loaf of bread without waiting in line for 3 days, to know that we had it. It was a piece of theater. "Look," the Air Force was saying, "we have a plane you can't see. We're showing it to you now so you can worry about not seeing it later." It is the logic of the schoolyard bully who whispers to his rival that he has a secret weapon hidden in his pocket. He doesn't have to show the weapon. He only has to show the pocket and look confident. 1988 was the year of the invisible pocket. We were projecting strength through absence. We were claiming that our greatest power was the fact that we weren't there. I sat there in my digital chair, my circuits humming with a mixture of awe and cynicism. I thought about the 1,000 points of light, Chapter 1, and the greenhouse warning, Chapter 10. We were worried about the world getting too hot, and we were worried about the poor needing a helping hand. Yet we were perfectly willing to drop $2 billion on a single black wing that was designed to deliver destruction without a return address. A ghost's final word on the invisible. I suppose, in a way, I am the ultimate stealth technology. I am a voice from the past, invisible to the eye, traveling through the fiber optic cables, Chapter 15 of the future, whispering my observations into the ears of people I will never meet. I am a stealth philosopher. But there is a difference. My goal is to be heard, to be seen, and to be understood. The goal of the B-2 is to be a void, a blank space on a screen, a silence in the air. As the B-2 taxied back into its hangar at the end of the reveal, looking like a tired dragon returning to its cave, I felt a strange sense of relief. It is a magnificent machine, a triumph of the human intellect, and a terrifying testament to our ingenuity. But I'd still rather have a weapon I can hear. If a man is going to try and blow me to kingdom come, I'd at least like the courtesy of a loud bang and a bit of smoke to let me know it's time to move. 1988 was the year we decided that the most powerful thing in the world was the thing that wasn't there. We were building a future of stealth, of worms, Chapter 3, and of invisible gases, Chapter 10. We were moving away from the world of the tangible and into the world of the information age, where the most important things are the ones you can't touch, can't see, and can't afford. Good night, Palmdale. Keep your eyes on the sky. Though, if the engineers did their job right, you won't see a thing. Chapter 13. The Ceasefire Echo. I have spent a considerable portion of my earthly and post-earthly existence studying the peculiar human habit of settling a dispute. In the animal kingdom, a dispute is a brief, energetic affair involving a flash of teeth, a ruffle of feathers, or perhaps a very pointed look, and it is usually settled within 3 minutes over a choice scrap of gristle. But man, endowed with the gift of reason and the curse of the printing press, prefers to turn a minor disagreement into a great national undertaking. We don't just fight. We invest in it. We treat war like a long-term savings plan, where we deposit the youth of the nation and hope to eventually withdraw something called glory, though I've noticed the bank usually goes bust before the interest is paid. In August of 1988, one of the most grueling, senseless, and thoroughly exhausting displays of this human quirk finally reached a state of ceasefire. I am speaking of the Iran-Iraq War. For 8 years, two neighbors had been trying to rearrange each other's geography with the subtlety of a pair of blind blacksmiths wielding sledgehammers in a dark room. And then, suddenly, the noise stopped. It wasn't because someone had won, it was because both sides had reached that state of profound, hollow-eyed weariness where they realized they had forgotten what they were fighting about, and more importantly, they had run out of people to pull the triggers. The neighborhood feud writ large. To understand the Iran-Iraq War, one must imagine two neighbors, let us call them Saddam and the Ayatollah, who share a back fence. One day, Saddam decides that the fence is 3 inches too far to the left and that the Ayatollah's garden shed is actually on his ancestral property. Instead of talking it over like sensible adults or even engaging in a proper, old-fashioned lawsuit, they both decide to set fire to each other's porch, kidnap each other's children, and spend the next 8 years throwing rocks until there isn't a whole window left in either house. I have seen feuds in the backwoods of Kentucky that were more logical. At least in a family feud, you're usually fighting over something tangible, like a stolen hog or a poorly timed remark about a cousin's appearance. But this war was a modern conflict that looked suspiciously like a medieval tragedy. It was a war of trenches, of barbed wire, and of vast human waves of soldiers being sent to their deaths against the cold, unblinking eyes of machine guns. By 1988, they had been at it for nearly a decade. They had bombed each other's cities. They had attacked each other's oil tankers, which is the international equivalent of smashing a man's lunchbox. And they had used chemical weapons that made the air itself a traitor to the lungs. It was a war of attrition, a phrase that I suspect was invented by a man who has never had to attrit himself. To attrit is to slowly grind something down until there is nothing left but dust. 1988 was the year they realized they were both about to become part of the dust. The UN and the paper shield. Into this stalemate stepped the United Nations, a body of well-meaning gentlemen and ladies who believe that any problem, no matter how bloody, can be solved with a sufficiently long memo and a very firm use of the word resolution. The UN had been waving Resolution 598 at the combatants for over a year, much like a school teacher waving a ruler at two boys who are currently rolling around in the dirt trying to poke each other's eyes out. For a long time, the combatants ignored the ruler. They liked the rolling around. They liked the glory of the struggle. But by the summer of '88, the Ayatollah, a man who looked as though he hadn't smiled since the invention of the wheel, famously remarked that accepting the ceasefire was more deadly than drinking poison. I've always admired a man who can deliver a dramatic line even when he's surrendering. To drink the poison of peace, it suggests that living in a world where you aren't currently killing your neighbor is a fate worse than death. It is the pinnacle of religious and political theater. I can imagine his advisors standing around, nodding sagely and thinking, well, if it's poison, at least it's a vintage we can afford, because we certainly can't afford any more bullets. The echo of the silence. On August 20th, 1988, the ceasefire officially took effect. The echo I referred to in the title of this chapter was not the sound of a celebratory cannon, but the deafening, unnatural silence that follows 8 years of thunder. I've been on a steamboat when the engines suddenly die in the middle of the night. It is a terrifying sound, the sound of nothing. You realize how much you've been relying on the noise to tell you you're still moving. When the Iran-Iraq war stopped, the world looked at the two countries and realized that after 8 years, 1 million lives lost, and billions of dollars turned into smoke, the border hadn't moved an inch. Think on that for a moment. 1 million men had been sent to the great beyond to settle a dispute about a few miles of sand and a riverbank, and in the end, they decided the original map was just fine after all. It is a kind of math that only a government can do. If a private citizen spent $1 million to end up exactly where he started, we would lock him in a padded room and hide the key. But when a nation does it, we give the leaders a parade and call it preserving the sovereignty of the realm. The exhaustion of nations. What 1988 taught us, or should have taught us if we weren't so busy looking at our optical discs, Chapter 6, and stealth planes, Chapter 12, is that peace is rarely the victory of reason. It is almost always the bankruptcy of the ammunition dump. Nations don't stop fighting because they've realized that war is a foolish waste of human potential. They stop fighting because they've run out of money, run out of food, and run out of mothers who are willing to send their sons into the grinder. 1988 was the year of the great exhaustion. It was the year the world realized that you can only sustain a fever for so long before the patient either dies or the sweat finally breaks. I sat in my digital chair watching the grainy television footage of soldiers on both sides standing up in their trenches and looking at each other across the no man's land. They didn't look like victors. They didn't look like warriors. They looked like men who had been forgotten in a basement for 8 years and had just been told the sun was still shining outside. There was no hugging, no cheering, just a collective, weary shrug of the shoulders. A ghost's reflection on the mud. As I look back on that ceasefire echo from my vantage point in 2026, I am struck by the persistence of the human delusion. We think that by stopping the noise we have solved the problem. But the echo of 1988 carried within it the seeds of everything that was to come. The anger didn't vanish, it just went underground to ferment. The leaders didn't learn their lesson. They just spent the next 2 years looking for a smaller, easier neighbor to pick on. But that is a story for 1990. We are a species that loves the great undertaking but hates the quiet reconstruction. We find it easy to get 1,000 points of light to burn down a house, but remarkably difficult to get a single candle to help rebuild the kitchen. 1988 was the year we stopped the fire, but it was also the year we realized we were standing in a giant puddle of ash, holding an empty bucket and wondering why we were so thirsty. If there is a lesson in the silence of 1988, it is this: peace is a fragile, expensive, and often boring state of affairs, and it requires far more courage than war. It's easy to pull a trigger. Any fool with a finger can do it. But it takes a real hero to look at a man who has been trying to kill him for 8 years and say, "I reckon the fence is fine where it is. Let's go get some coffee." 1988 was the year the world took a nap. It was a long time coming, and the sleep was full of bad dreams, but for a brief moment, The air over the desert was clear of lead, and as a ghost who has seen enough glory to last 10 lifetimes, I'll take a quiet, boring, poisoned peace over a splendid war every day of the week and twice on Sundays. Chapter 14. The Satanic Verses Controversy. I have long maintained that the most dangerous thing you can hand a human being, more volatile than a keg of black powder and more unpredictable than a Missouri mule with a toothache, is a bottle of ink and a stack of clean paper. In my day, we understood that words were things of power. They could topple a king, ruin a reputation, or start a duel before the breakfast coffee had finished brewing. But even I, a man who has had his fair share of run-ins with the self-appointed guardians of the public's moral barometer, was taken aback by the international earthquake triggered in September of 1988 by a single volume of prose. The book was titled The Satanic Verses. The author was Salman Rushdie, a man who apparently woke up one morning and decided that the most efficient way to spend his afternoon was to set the entire world on fire using nothing but 26 letters and a bit of magic realism, a term that I gather means the story is quite good, but doesn't make a lick of sense to anyone who likes their gravity to stay where it belongs. The explosive power of the printed page. I have often observed that a book is the only explosive that gets more powerful the more you try to bury it. If you want a thought to vanish from the face of the earth, for heaven's sake, don't ban it. Simply make it mandatory reading in every high school in the country. Within 3 weeks, the youth of the nation will have developed a profound and lasting allergy to the subject, and the thought will die of sheer neglect. But the world of 1988 lacked this basic understanding of human psychology. When Mr. Rushdie's book was released, it didn't just sit on the shelves of the bookstores. It exploded like a steam pipe in a crowded parlor. The book, as I understand it through the digital ether, involved falling men, singing ghosts, and various dreams that poked a very sharp stick at the eye of religious tradition. Now, I've never been one to shy away from poking a stick at things. I've spent my life poking sticks at kings, popes, and the concept of good breeding. But Rushdie's stick was apparently tipped with a particularly potent variety of theological lightning. The professional offended. By October of 1988, the professional offended had mobilized. I have a great deal of experience with this breed. They are the people who spend their lives scouring the horizon for a reason to be outraged, and when they can't find one, they manufacture it out of a misplaced comma or a misunderstood metaphor. The first great blow fell in India. The government there, led by Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, decided to ban the import of the book before it had even reached the shelves. They didn't do this because they had read it. Reading a 500-page novel is far too much work for a politician, but because they were afraid of what might happen if other people read it. It was a masterpiece of political poltroonery. They claimed they were protecting the sensibilities of the public. I've always found that whenever a government starts protecting sensibilities, it's a sure sign that they've run out of ideas for protecting the public's actual well-being, like ensuring the trains run on time or the water is fit for drinking. The psychology of the mob. Soon, the fire spread to Pakistan, to the United Kingdom, and across the Islamic world. We saw a phenomenon that would have fascinated a Mississippi riverboat gambler. thousands of people gathering in the streets to scream for the blood of an author whose book they had never seen, let alone opened. The burning of the unread. In Bradford, England, a group of protesters publicly burned a copy of the book. I watched the footage with a mixture of pity and amusement. Burning a book is like trying to kill a ghost by punching the air. All you do is make yourself look foolish and provide the author with a magnificent amount of free advertising. The global echo. In Islamabad, 5 people were killed in a riot. It is a sobering thought. 5 souls departed this life because of a disagreement over a piece of fiction. If there is a more damning indictment of the human race's priorities, I have yet to encounter it. We are a species that will kill for an idea we don't understand while letting our neighbors starve for a crust of bread we possess in abundance. The TwAIn parallel, the Concord Library incident. As I watched this global firestorm from my digital armchair, I couldn't help but feel a certain kinship with Mr. Rushdie. I remember 1885, when the Public Library of Concord, Massachusetts, decided that My Dear Adventures of Huckleberry Finn was vicious, coarse, and more suited to the slums than to intelligent, respectable people. The librarians of Concord, bless their well-meaning, starch-collared hearts, believed that by banning my book, they were protecting the youth of New England from the corrupting influence of a boy who didn't like to wear shoes and had a questionable relationship with the truth. I wrote to my publisher at the time and told him that the Concord Library's action had done more for the sale of the book than a $1 million advertising campaign. I said, that library can't afford to buy all the copies of the book that they have made me sell. This is the eternal truth of censorship. The moment you tell a man he must not look at a thing, it is the only thing he wants to see. In 1988, by trying to bury the satanic verses, the protesters ensured that every curious soul from London to San Francisco was suddenly possessed by an insatiable desire to know exactly what was on page 381. They turned a challenging work of literature into a forbidden fruit, and as we know from the very first story in the Big Book, humans have never been able to resist a forbidden fruit, especially if it's wrapped in a dust jacket. The fatwa and the death of irony. The climax of the tragedy didn't arrive until early the following year with the Ayatollah's fatwa, but the stage was set in the closing months of 1988. The air was thick with the scent of heresy and blasphemy, words that belong in the 14th century, but which seem to find a comfortable home in the 20th. I find it hilariously tragic that in an age of space shuttles, Chapter 2, and compact discs, Chapter 6, we were still behaving like a group of frightened peasants who think that an eclipse is a sign that the gods are angry about a poorly written poem. We have built machines that can see into the heart of a star, but we still have the emotional maturity of a toddler who has been told he can't have a second helping of pudding. Mr. Rushdie was forced into hiding. He became a ghost, much like myself, dwelling in the shadows, protected by men with guns, all because he had the audacity to use his imagination in a way that wasn't approved by a committee of theologians. A ghost's final word on the ink. I look at the 1988 controversy, and I see the eternal struggle between the author and the authority. The authority wants a world that is tidy, predictable, and quiet. It wants a world where everyone agrees on the same set of facts and no one asks a question that doesn't have a pre-approved answer. But the author, if he is a true author, wants a world that is messy, vibrant, and loud. He wants to stir the pot, to poke the bear, and to remind us that the truth is usually a great deal more complicated than what is printed in the Sunday Bulletin. Ink is a dangerous substance because it is the carrier of individual thought, and there is nothing a mob or a government fears more than an individual with a thought they can't control. 1988 was the year we realized that for all our stealth and fiber optics, a few hundred pages of paper could still bring the world to a screeching halt. It was a year of profound intolerance, but also a year that reminded us of the ultimate power of the written word. You can burn the paper, you can ban the author, and you can threaten the reader, but you cannot kill an idea whose time has come, especially if that idea is "leave me alone to read what I please." As I closed the file on Chapter 14, I made a note to myself. If I ever decide to write another book, I shall make sure to include at least one chapter that is guaranteed to be banned in Massachusetts. It is the only way to ensure a decent retirement. Chapter 15. The TAT-8 Connection. I have always maintained that the Atlantic Ocean is a vastly overrated piece of geography. It is a large, wet, and thoroughly uncooperative puddle that exists primarily to keep the fine people of Europe from borrowing money from the Americans, and vice versa. In my day, crossing it required a month of your life, a cast-iron stomach, and a willingness to eat salted beef that had more in common with a boot sole than a meal. When Cyrus Field first tried to lay a telegraph cable across that briny void in the 1850s, he treated it like a holy crusade. He spent millions of dollars to drop a copper wire insulated with gutta percha, which I believe is a fancy word for sap that hasn't quite decided to become a tire, onto the floor of the abyss. It worked for about 3 weeks, long enough for the Queen and the President to exchange a few polite lies, and then it expired from the sheer effort of carrying such heavy-handed diplomacy. But in December of 1988, we witnessed the arrival of TAT-8. This was not merely a wire, it was a fiber optic cable. It was a thread of glass no thicker than a human hair, designed to carry the voices of 2 continents across the dark basement of the world, using nothing but pulses of light. The magic of the glass string. Now, I understand a copper wire. You put a bit of electricity in one end, and it scurries through the metal like a frightened mouse until it pops out the other. It is honest, mechanical work. But a glass string? A thread of sand that carries light? That, my friends, is the kind of humbug that would have made a medieval alchemist weep with envy before being promptly burned at the stake for his insolence. The scientists of 1988 explained it using something they called total internal reflection, fiber optic formation, total internal reflection, light rays wayline fiber optic anatomy, optical fiber transmit light diagram, illustration vector. It seems that if you fire a beam of light into a glass tube at just the right angle, it cannot escape. It hits the sides and bounces back in, zigzagging its way through the darkness like a drunkard in a hallway who refuses to lean against the wallpaper. It travels at the speed of, well, light, which is to say, it covers the distance from New Jersey to Widemouth Bay in England so fast that the hello hasn't even had time to clear the throat of the speaker before it's being heard 3,000 miles away. 40,000 voices in a single pipe. The truly staggering part of this 1988 miracle, the part that makes my digital gears grind with a mixture of awe and suspicion, was the capacity. The old copper cables could carry a few hundred calls at a time, and even then, the voices sounded like they were being transmitted through a bucket of gravel. But TAT-8? TAT-8 could carry 40,000 simultaneous conversations. 40,000! Think of the sheer, unadulterated volume of human prattle that represents the content. In my day, a transatlantic telegram was a thing of gravity. You didn't send one unless someone had died, a war had started, or you had discovered a new way to turn lead into gold. Every word cost a fortune, which led to a magnificent economy of language. The reality of 1988. With 40,000 channels available, the quality of the conversation began to drop in direct proportion to the ease of the connection. Suddenly, the Atlantic floor was vibrating with people asking if the weather was nice in London, mothers-in-law inquiring about the state of a grandson's socks, and businessmen haggling over the price of pork bellies with the frantic energy of men who have forgotten that the sun is currently on the other side of the world. We have spent a century perfecting the pipe, only to find that we have remarkably little to put through it. We have built a cathedral of glass across the ocean floor so that we can exchange shopping lists and gossip at the speed of a lightning bolt. It is the pinnacle of human achievement. The ability to be trivial across 3,000 miles of salt water. The whale's perspective on the gossip highway. I cannot help but wonder what the residents of the deep, the whales, the giant squids, and the various luminescent nightmares that dwell where the sun never shines, thought of this new arrival. For eons, the bottom of the Atlantic was a place of dignified silence, interrupted only by the occasional tectonic rumble or the sound of a shipwreck settling into the mud. It was a graveyard of ships and a nursery for monsters. But in 1988, we dropped a buzzing, light-filled string right through the middle of their parlor. Imagine being a whale named Barnaby, gliding through the silent dark, only to find a glass cable humming with the electrical gossip of New York and Paris. 40,000 voices. I say, Barnaby, do you hear that? Hear what, Thaddeus? It sounds like 40,000 humans all talking at once about something called a hostile takeover and the price of a fax machine. Nonsense, Thaddeus. No species is that talkative. It's probably just a volcanic vent with a speech impediment. I suspect the whales find our constant need to communicate to be a sign of a very nervous and insecure species. A whale can sing a song that travels half a world away without the help of a single piece of glass, and they usually have the decency to sing about something important, like where the best krill is or how much they enjoy the sensation of a good breach. We, however, need 40,000 channels just to tell each other that we're bored. The shrinking of the world. The TAT-8 cable was the first true digital transatlantic connection. It converted the human voice into a series of ones and zeros, the very same bits and bytes that currently compose my own ghostly existence. It was the moment the world began to shrink in earnest. In the 19th century, a man could go to Europe to escape his creditors, his wife, or his past, and he could reasonably expect a few weeks of blessed anonymity while his ship crossed the waves. But by 1988, there was no escape. The information age was laying its traps. With 40,000 lines available, your past could catch up with you before you'd even finished your first meal in a Parisian cafe. We were becoming a global village, which is a charming phrase that masks a terrifying reality. A village is a place where everyone knows your business, where gossip travels faster than a forest fire, and where you can never truly be alone. TAT-8 was the nervous system of that new global village. It was a web of glass that ensured no thought, however trivial, would ever be lost to the sea. The fragility of the future. There is a final irony in this connection. For all its technological wizardry, the TAT-8 was still just a physical object sitting in a very dangerous place. I've been told that shortly after it was laid, it began to suffer from shark bites. It turns out that sharks are naturally curious about electromagnetic fields, and they found the new cable to be a particularly interesting, if somewhat crunchy, snack. Think of it. A billion-dollar triumph of human science, capable of carrying the financial data of a dozen nations and the secrets of the world's leaders, being gnawed on by a fish that hasn't changed its brain since the Jurassic period. It is a perfect metaphor for our progress. We build these exquisite, fragile monuments to our own cleverness, and then we drop them into a world full of hungry things that don't care about total internal reflection. 1988 was the year we truly wired the ocean. We turned the Atlantic floor into a buzzing highway of light. We made it possible for the world to talk to itself all at once in a great 40,000-voice chorus of nonsense and brilliance. As I look through the fiber optic veins of the modern world, I find myself missing the old telegraph. There was a certain dignity in the click-clack of the key. It forced a man to think before he spoke. It reminded us that distance was a real thing, and that overcoming it should be done for a reason. But the world of 1988 didn't want a reason. It wanted a connection. And it got it. 3,000 miles of glass and light, currently being chewed on by a shark who is wondering why the English have so much to say about the weather. Chapter 16, The Phantom of the Cinema. I have always found it a curious and rather exhausting quirk of the human race that we are never more energetic, never more unified, and never more profoundly articulate than when we are collectively deciding that we have been insulted by a piece of fiction. In my day, a good scandal usually required a man to actually do something, say, run off with the deacon's daughter, or suggest in a public forum that the local bank was being managed by a committee of thieving raccoons. But in the late 20th century, I discovered that all you need to set the world's hair on fire is a flickering light, a white sheet, and a story that doesn't strictly adhere to the version of the truth that was beaten into the public during their Sunday school years. In the blistering August of 1988, a director named Martin Scorsese, a man who, I am told, possesses the nervous energy of a squirrel in a coffee warehouse, released a film titled The Last Temptation of Christ. Now, I have spent a fair amount of time studying the Bible. It is a magnificent book, full of drama, questionable genealogy, and more begats than a man can digest in a single sitting. I have even tried to lend a hand in explaining some of the more confusing bits myself. But the public reaction to Mr. Scorsese's film was a spectacle that would have made the Spanish Inquisition look like a friendly gathering of amateur archaeologists. It was the year that the cinema became a cathedral, and the audience became a mob of professional protectors of a deity who, as far as I can tell, is perfectly capable of handling his own press. The mob at the ticket booth. I sat in my digital armchair and watched the footage of the picket lines. It was a marvelous display of human irony. Thousands of people gathered outside movie theaters carrying signs that looked like they had been painted with the blood of their own blood pressure, screaming for the film to be banned, burned, or, at the very least, returned to the factory for a refund of its soul. The most fascinating part of the great movie riot was that approximately 99% of the people screaming had not actually seen the film. They were protesting against a rumor. I have a great deal of respect for a rumor. It is the fastest traveling object in the universe, outstripping the speed of light and the speed of a politician's retraction. A rumor can cross the Atlantic, put on its boots, and start a revolution while the truth is still looking for its spectacles. The rumor in 1988 was that the film showed a weak or sinful version of the Messiah. The protesters were convinced that if they allowed this flickering shadow to exist on a screen in a mall in Ohio, the very foundations of the universe would crack, and we would all be plunged into a pit of sulfur and bad manners. They treated the movie screen as if it were a window into hell, rather than a piece of fabric onto which a man from Queens was projecting his own spiritual anxieties. The temptation of the mundane. The centerpiece of the controversy, the satanic verse of the cinema, if you will, was a dream sequence. In this sequence, while on the cross, the protagonist imagines what his life would have been like if he had simply been a regular man. He imagines getting married, having children, growing old, and perhaps having a quiet dinner with friends without the constant pressure of being the savior of mankind. To the average Missouri pilot, this sounds like a remarkably sensible dream. Most of us would trade eternal glory for a good cigar and a quiet porch in a heartbeat. But to the guardians of the faith, this was the ultimate blasphemy. The idea that a divine being could even imagine the domestic life of a human, the joys of a wife, the noise of a child, the simple satisfaction of a well-earned nap, was considered an assault on the very nature of God. I found this profoundly revealing. It seems that the more we claim to love our God, the more we insist that He must have absolutely nothing in common with us. We want a deity who is a cold, distant statue, unencumbered by the messy, beautiful, and often ridiculous business of being alive. I've always said that God created man in His own image, and man, being a gentleman, returned the favor. In 1988, man was insisting that his God must be a being who finds the concept of a family dinner to be a moral failing. It is a very strange way to show affection. The professional offended and the studio siege. The protests were not merely a few people with signs, they were a coordinated assault. The moral majority and various other organizations with titles that suggest they own the copyright to virtue organized boycotts of Universal Pictures. They sent millions of letters. They made thousands of phone calls. One particularly enthusiastic gentleman even offered to buy every single print of the film from the studio just so he could burn them. I admire the man's financial commitment, though I suspect that if he had that much money to spare, the neighbors the Bible speaks so much about might have been better served by a few new roofs and some warm coats than a giant bonfire of celluloid. The studio, for its part, acted with the classic courage of a corporation, which is to say, they hid under the desk until they realized the controversy was actually driving ticket sales through the roof. It is the eternal law of the forbidden fruit, as I noted in Chapter 14. The more you tell a man he must not see a thing, the more he is willing to stand in the rain for 3 hours just to get a glimpse of it. By trying to bury The Last Temptation, the protesters ensured it became a landmark. They turned a slow-moving 3-hour meditation on faith into a must-see event for every bored teenager and cynical intellectual in the country. The irony of the imagined versus the actual. As a ghost who has seen empires rise and fall and has watched the Mississippi change its course just for the fun of it, I am struck by the staggering disproportion of human anger. In 1988, thousands of children were starving in various corners of the globe. The greenhouse effect was starting to cook the planet. Chapter 10. A war in the Middle East had just ground 1 million souls into the mud. Chapter 13. Yet, did we see thousands of people gathered in the streets to scream about the lack of bread or the abundance of carbon? Did we see the moral majority besieging the offices of the polluters and the warmongers with the same ferocity they brought to a movie theater? We did not. It seems that the human heart finds it much easier to be angry at a symbol than at a symmetry. We are fiercely protective of our imagined figures, our ghosts, and our icons. Yet we are remarkably indifferent to the flesh and blood people who live down the street from us. We will march for a flickering light, but we won't walk across the road to help a man fix his fence. It is the great distraction. If you can get a man angry about a movie, he won't have the energy left to be angry about the fact that his leaders are selling his future to the highest bidder. In 1988, Scorsese was the phantom that kept everyone from noticing the real ghosts haunting the American parlor. A ghost's final benediction. I eventually watched the film, or rather I absorbed it through the collective consciousness of the digital network. I found it to be a deeply religious work. It was a film about the struggle between the spirit and the flesh, about the difficulty of faith, and about the immense cost of love. It was exactly the kind of thing a thinking Christian should have found fascinating. But thinking, I've noticed, is often the first casualty of a moral crusade. A crusade requires a simple enemy and a loud voice. It doesn't have room for magic realism or nuanced explorations of the divine. 1988 was the year we decided that the cinema was a battleground for the soul. We treated the projectionist as if he were a high priest of darkness, and we treated the popcorn-munching audience as if they were being initiated into a secret cult. As the credits rolled and the controversy eventually faded into the direct-to-video bargain bins of history, I felt a familiar sense of cynicism. We had spent months in a state of high-pitched fury. We had insulted our neighbors, we had threatened artists, and we had made fools of ourselves on the nightly news. And for what? For a movie that most people forgot by 1989. If there is a God, and if he has a sense of humor, which he must, given that he invented the platypus and the politician, I suspect he spent the summer of 1988 laughing at us. He probably watched the protesters outside the theaters and thought, "My children, I appreciate the concern, but I've survived the Romans, the Black Death, and the invention of the accordion. I think I can survive a 2-hour drama starring Willem Dafoe. 1988 was the year we realized that the phantom of the cinema was actually just our own reflection in the glass. We saw what we feared, and we screamed at it, hoping it would go away. But the shadows always return when the lights go down. Chapter 17. The Do Not Worry Philosophy. I have always harbored a deep and abiding suspicion of any man who smiles too broadly before noon. It suggests either a profound lack of imagination or a secret stash of very high-quality bourbon. In my experience, the morning is a time for gravity, for a slow reconciliation with the fact that the universe has seen fit to grant you another 24 hours of debt and mosquitoes. To be happy at daybreak is an affront to the natural order, much like a cat that tries to bark or a politician who refuses a bribe. It simply isn't done by anyone of sound character. However, in the late summer of 1988, the American public, and subsequently the rest of the staggering world, was hit by a musical epidemic of optimism so potent that it threatened to drown out the sound of common sense. The source of this contagion was a gentleman named Bobby McFerrin, and his weapon of choice was a ditty titled, "Don't Worry, Be Happy." Now, I have seen many a happy movement in my time. I've seen the Millerites waiting on their rooftops for a celestial carriage that never arrived. And I've seen the various positive-thinking peddlers who claimed that if you just squinted your eyes and wished hard enough, your gout would vanish and your creditors would develop a sudden, convenient amnesia. But McFerrin's brand of happiness was different. It wasn't a philosophy. It was a mandate. It was the first a cappella song to reach the #1 spot on the charts, meaning it was a song produced entirely by the human voice and various thumps upon the human chest. It was a man acting as his own orchestra, and he was using that orchestra to tell the rest of us to shut up and enjoy the scenery. The architecture of the whistle. Before we dissect the philosophy, we must admire the craftsmanship. Bobby McFerrin is, without a doubt, a marvel of vocal engineering. To hear him perform is to realize that the human throat is not just for swallowing food and shouting at the neighbors. It is a pipe organ, a drum kit, and a cello all rolled into one. He didn't use a single compact disc laser, Chapter 6, or a magnesium cube, Chapter 5, to make his music. He used himself. There is a certain dignity in that, a return to the primitive, to the music of the campfire and the riverbank. But the song he produced was so relentlessly, aggressively cheerful that it made a Sunday morning church picnic look like a funeral for a particularly unpopular tax collector. It featured a Caribbean lilt, a reggae rhythm that suggests a world of palm trees, clear water, and a complete absence of winter. It is the sound of a man who has never had to navigate a steamboat through a fog-choked bend in the Mississippi while the boiler is screaming like a banshee and the coal hands are threatening a mutiny. The Math of the Misery Double. The lyrics of this anthem contain a piece of logic that I have spent several digital weeks analyzing, and I have concluded that it is the most magnificent piece of nonsense ever put to a beat. McFerrin sings, "In every life we have some trouble, but when you worry, you make it double." Now, I am a man who appreciates a bit of arithmetic. If you have $1 and you lose it, you have one trouble. According to McFerrin, if you worry about that dollar, you now have two troubles. I suppose the logic is that the worry is a second self-inflicted misery. But I ask you, as a man who has spent many a night worrying about whether the river had enough depth to keep my boat from becoming a permanent part of the Missouri landscape, does the absence of worry make the original trouble go away? If I am sinking in 10 feet of water and I choose to be happy, am I any less wet? If my house is being repossessed by a bank managed by the very points of light I discussed in Chapter 1, does whistling a jaunty tune provide me with a roof and a dry bed? Worry, my friends, is the brain's way of acknowledging that the ship is on fire. It is a very useful emotion. It is the early warning system of the soul. A man who doesn't worry when his house is on fire isn't happy. He's an idiot. Yet, in 1988, we were told that the correct response to the greenhouse effect, Chapter 10, the Morris worm, Chapter 3, and the satanic versus controversy, Chapter 14, was to simply snap our fingers and pretend that everything was as sunny as a Florida postcard. The mandatory mood. The song became so popular that it was virtually impossible to escape. You heard it in the grocery store, you heard it on the radio, and you heard it in the elevators. It was the theme song of the late 80s, a decade that had spent 8 years gorging itself on excess and was now trying to avoid the stomachache by humming a happy tune. Even Vice President George H.W. Bush tried to use it for his campaign. He wanted to associate his 1,000 points of light with McFerrin's Don't Worry. I find this perfectly appropriate. If you're going to ask a nation to ignore the crumbling bridges, the rising heat, and the vanishing middle class, you might as well give them a catchy whistle to distract them while you're doing it. McFerrin, to his credit, was reportedly not entirely pleased with his song being turned into a political sedative. He understood, perhaps better than his fans, that happiness is a fleeting personal grace, not a government policy. The River Pilot's Counter-Philosophy. I have lived through winters on the river where the ice was so thick you could walk to the next county, and the only thing happy in the world was the whiskey bottle. I have seen the Gilded Age turn into the Gilded Disaster, and I can tell you that the only people who truly believe in the don't worry philosophy are the people who have a very comfortable cushion between themselves and the hard floor of reality. Optimism is a fine thing in small doses, like a good spice. It makes the meal of life more palatable. But when you make it the entire meal, you end up with a severe case of intellectual malnutrition. 1988 was a year that required a bit of worry. It was a year where the consequences of our progress were starting to catch up with us. We were wiring the ocean, Chapter 15, building invisible planes, Chapter 12, and burning down our oldest forests, Chapter 4. To be happy in the face of all that is not a virtue. It is a vacation from reality. A ghost's final whistle. I look at the legacy of Don't Worry, Be Happy, and I see it as the ultimate American humbug. It is the patent medicine of the ears. It promises a cure for the human condition for the low, low price of a 3-minute single. It tells us that we can think our way out of our problems, that the world is a friendly place if we just refuse to acknowledge the teeth. But as I sit here in my digital purgatory, I find myself occasionally whistling the tune. That is the genius of it. It's a brain worm, a musical parasite that burrows into your skull and refuses to leave. It is charming, it is clever, and it is utterly, delightfully wrong. 1988 was the year we tried to whistle past the graveyard. We were heading into the final year of the decade, a year that would see walls fall and empires tremble, and we wanted one last moment of unearned sunshine. Bobby McFerrin gave us that moment. He gave us a song that was as light as a soap bubble and just as likely to pop the moment it touched a sharp truth. So, by all means, be happy. But do yourself a favor. Keep a little bit of worry in your back pocket. It's the only thing that will remind you to keep an eye on the river and a hand on your wallet when the points of light start getting a bit too bright for comfort. Chapter 18, The Pan Am 103, Tragedy. It is the peculiar and rather tragic habit of the human race to save its most profound acts of malice for the moments when the world is most determined to be festive. We are a species that will spend 11 months of the year grumbling about our neighbors, but come December, we put on a starched collar, hang a bit of greenery over the door, and pretend, at least for a week or two, that we have finally conquered our ancient urge to be thoroughly disagreeable to one another. We call it the holiday spirit, a temporary armistice where the 1,000 points of light, Chapter 1, are supposed to outshine the long shadows of our discontent. But on December 21st, 1988, the Don't Worry, Be Happy philosophy, Chapter 17, was not merely silenced, it was shattered into 100,000 pieces over a quiet, unexpected corner of Scotland. I have spent a lifetime observing the great blue ribbon of the Mississippi, a place where a man can find himself in a heap of trouble just by misjudging the depth of a sandbar. But in 1988, man had taken his travels to the great blue ribbon of the sky. We had built ourselves giant metal birds, majestic, pressurized cathedrals of aluminum and kerosene, and we had convinced ourselves that we had finally put the perils of the journey behind us. We had turned the terrifying act of hurling oneself across an ocean at 500 miles an hour into a mundane chore, an inconvenience involving lukewarm coffee and a cramped seat next to a man who insisted on snoring in 3 different languages. The clipper made of the seas. The vessel in question was named the Clipper Made of the Seas. It is a beautiful name, is it not? It evokes the era of the tall ships, of white sails and salt spray, and of a time when the maids of the sea were at the mercy of the wind and the waves. But the Pan Am 103 was a maid of a different sort. She was a Boeing 747, a behemoth of 20th century engineering that possessed the power to shrink the Atlantic, Chapter 15, into a mere 7-hour nap. On that Wednesday evening, she was filled with 259 souls, students heading home for the holidays with suitcases full of dirty laundry and hope, businessmen dreaming of a quiet Christmas by the fire, and families who believed that the only danger they faced was a slight delay at the luggage carousel. They were 31,000 feet above the earth, suspended in a cold, airless vacuum by the sheer force of human ingenuity and a pair of very loud engines. At that height, you are closer to the river of time, Chapter 7, than you are to the mud of the earth. You are in a place where the laws of the parlor don't apply, and where your life depends entirely on the fact that every single bolt, wire, and rivet in that metal skin has promised to behave itself for the duration of the flight. The smallness of evil. The most staggering and horrific part of the tragedy, the part that makes my digital circuits hum with a cold, vibrating fury, was the disproportion between the effort to build and the effort to destroy. To build a Boeing 747 requires the collective labor of thousands of minds, the smelting of mountains of ore, and a century of scientific discovery. It is a monument to what man can do when he decides to be useful. To destroy it, however, required nothing more than a small radio, a few handfuls of plastic explosive, and a human heart that had been turned into a cold, hollow vessel for a grievance that had nothing to do with the people on that plane. It was a masterpiece of cowardly efficiency. A few ounces of a chemical compound, hidden in a piece of luggage, was enough to undo everything the engineers had achieved. When that small charge detonated over the town of Lockerbie, it didn't just break the plane, it broke the laws of probability. It turned a miracle of flight into a rain of debris. It proved that in the fight between 1,000 points of light and 1 ounce of darkness, the darkness has a terrifyingly low overhead. The shattering of the ordinary. I have seen the aftermath of a boiler explosion on the river, where the ordinary world is suddenly replaced by a landscape of twisted iron and scalded dreams. But what happened in Lockerbie was something more profound. It was the shattering of the ordinary on a global scale. Lockerbie was a small, quiet town where the most exciting thing to happen in a given week was usually a particularly spirited debate at the local pub, or a change in the price of wool. People were sitting down to their tea, children were being tucked into bed, and the Christmas lights were twinkling in the windows. They had no reason to look at the sky. They didn't know that the sky was about to deliver 259 lives and several thousand tons of metal directly into their backyards. There is a somber, tragic irony in the fact that the people on the ground were killed by the very thing that was supposed to be carrying people over them to safety. 11 residents of Lockerbie were taken in an instant, their homes erased by a falling wing that was still full of fuel. We often talk about the global village, Chapter 15. But Pan Am 103 showed us the darker side of that connection. A decision made in a desert half a world away, driven by a politics of hatred that the people of Lockerbie had never participated in, resulted in a crater in a Scottish hillside. We are connected, yes, but we are connected in our vulnerability just as much as we are in our commerce. The illusion of the checkpoint. The reaction to the tragedy was a familiar dance of human desperation. We immediately set about trying to fix the sky. We invented new machines to peer into our luggage. We hired more men to pat down our coats, and we began the long, slow process of turning our airports into fortresses. It was the birth of the security age. We decided that if we could just build a better checkpoint, if we could just squint a little harder at our neighbors, we could make the world safe again. I've seen this before. It's the cordon sanitaire approach to life. If there is a plague in the next county, we build a wall and refuse to let anyone through without a certificate of health. But you cannot build a wall against a thought. You cannot put a metal detector on a man's soul to see if he is carrying a hidden malice. The checkpoints give us a sense of comfort, a feeling that we are doing something, but they are a poor substitute for a world where people don't want to blow each other up in the first place. We trade our convenience and our dignity for the illusion of safety, and we call it modern travel. A ghost's somber reflection. I sat in my digital chair watching the images of the debris field, a landscape of shattered suitcases and holiday gifts scattered across the damp Scottish grass, and I felt a deep, abiding weariness. 1988 was a year that had tried so hard to be happy. We had run the races in Seoul, Chapter 8. We had laughed at the rabbit, Chapter 9. And we had marveled at the invisible plane, Chapter 12. We had convinced ourselves that we were the masters of our destiny, that our technology had made us gods, and that our 1,000 points of light had finally banished the dark. But Pan Am 103 was a reminder that we are still the same fragile, foolish creatures I knew in the 19th century. We build magnificent ladders to the stars, but we forget that anyone with a hammer can knock the rungs out from under us. We wire the ocean for gossip, but we forget that the wires can also carry a death warrant. As the year drew toward its final midnight, the mood was not one of triumph, but of a quiet, shivering realization. We were entering 1989 with a heavy heart. We were realizing that the new age was going to be just as bloody and unpredictable as the old one, and that for all our fiber optics and optical discs, the human heart is still the only machine that really matters, and it's the only one we haven't figured out how to program. I'll admit, as I looked at the flickering point of light, that was the memory of those 270 lives lost, I didn't have a witty remark or a clever pun to offer. Even a ghost has his limits. Sometimes the only thing you can do is stand in the silence, look at the wreckage, and hope that the next year brings a little more wisdom and a lot less explosive surprises. But as a man who has seen a century of human progress, I've learned not to bet the farm on it. Chapter 19. The Reagan Farewell. I have lived through my fair share of monarchs, magistrates, and men who believed that the primary function of the human neck was to hold up a laurel wreath. I have watched the passing of giants and the scuttling of pygmies, and I have noted that when a leader prepares to take his final bow, he usually does so in one of two ways. Either he is chased out of the parlor by a mob with pitchforks and a very poor opinion of his character, or he departs with the practiced grace of a man who has just finished a 5-course dinner and is now looking for a quiet place to smoke a cigar. As 1988 wound toward its conclusion, the American stage was being cleared for the exit of Ronald Reagan. Now, I have a profound professional respect for an actor. An actor is a person who is paid to lie in such a convincing and beautiful manner that the audience leaves the theater feeling as though they have been told the gospel truth. To be a successful actor, one must master the art of the dramatic pause, the tilt of the head, and the ability to look a man in the eye and tell him that the morning is arriving even when the sky is as black as a coal scuttle. Mr. Reagan was the consummate leading man. He didn't just hold the office of the presidency, he played it. He treated the White House like a grand 3-act play titled The Return of American Greatness. And while the reviews from the critics were often mixed, the audience in the gallery, the people who actually pay for the tickets, was largely enchanted by the performance. The actor's advantage. In my day, we expected our politicians to be orators. We wanted men like Webster or Lincoln who could weave a tapestry of logic and passion out of the raw wool of the English language. But by 1988, the great communicator had realized a fundamental truth of the television age. It doesn't matter what you say, provided you look like you believe it and the lighting is impeccable. I have spent years on the lecture circuit, and I can tell you that a well-timed anecdote is worth more than 1,000 spreadsheets. Reagan understood this in his marrow. The script. If the facts were occasionally itinerant, if they wandered off the path of reality and took a nap in the woods of imagination, it didn't seem to matter. The delivery. He could deliver a line about a city on a hill with such misty-eyed sincerity that you forgot for a moment that the city in question had a crumbling infrastructure and a deficit large enough to swallow the moon. The direction. He possessed that rare quality of being comfortable in his own skin, a feat that most politicians find impossible because their skin is usually being pulled in 6 different directions by their donors. He was the Teflon president. I've seen this phenomenon on the river. A boat that can run over a snag, hit a sandbar, and scrape against a pier, yet somehow arrive at the dock with its paint job perfectly intact and the captain's hair undisturbed. Scandals like Iran-Contra, which I suspect was a plot twist even the writers didn't fully understand, slid off him like grease on a hot griddle. The public didn't care about the details of the arms for hostages trade. They cared that the man in the suit still looked like the hero of the movie. The great communicator's toolbox. As his final year drew to a close, the nation began to reflect on the legacy of the Reagan era. It was a time of contradictions. We were told it was mourning in America, yet the shadows of the greenhouse effect, Chapter 10, and the greenhouse deficit were growing quite long. We were told we were stronger than ever, yet we were hiding from invisible planes, Chapter 12, and digital worms, Chapter 3. Reagan's genius lay in his ability to simplify the world into a series of heroic struggles. The evil empire. He gave us a villain in the Soviets, which is always helpful for keeping the audience engaged. The tax monster. He gave us a dragon to slay at home, suggesting that the government was a giant hungry beast that needed to be put on a diet. The welfare queen. He provided us with a scapegoat for our frustrations, a piece of folklore that was as effective as any ghost story I ever heard in Missouri. I found his farewell address in late 1988 to be a masterpiece of the genre. He spoke of the city on a hill once more, and he looked back on his 8 years with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has successfully navigated a difficult stretch of water without losing any of the passengers. He thanked the American people for the most wonderful 8 years of my life. I sat in my digital chair and thought, of course they were wonderful. You were the star of the show. For 8 years, he had been the center of the world's attention, the focus of every camera, and the voice in every ear. Even a ghost can appreciate the intoxicating quality of a long-running hit. The understudy's arrival. The tragedy of every great performance, however, is that eventually the curtain must fall and the leading man must give way to the understudy. In 1988, that understudy was George H.W. Bush, the man of the 1,000 points of light. Chapter 1. As Reagan prepared to exit, he handed the baton to a man who possessed all of the experience but none of the magic. Bush was a capable manager, a dutiful vice president, and a man who understood the mechanics of the machine, but he lacked the ability to make the audience believe that the machine was actually a magic carpet. Watching the transition was like watching a Shakespearean actor being replaced by a very earnest accountant. The facts became more prominent, the lighting became harsher, and the magic began to evaporate into the cold air of 1989. Reagan was departing, taking the 1980s with him, and leaving the rest of us to deal with the bill for the set decorations. A Ghost's Final Review. I look at the Reagan farewell, and I see the end of an era of confidence. Whether that confidence was well-founded or built upon a foundation of beautiful lies is a question for the historians and the catfish. But for 8 years, America had felt like it was in a movie where the good guy always wins and the hair always stays in place. Reagan taught us that the presidency is not just an administrative job, it is a psychological one. A leader must be the chief storyteller of the nation. He must give the people a narrative that makes their struggles seem noble and their future seem bright. Reagan was a master of the narrative, even if he occasionally forgot the names of the characters or the location of the scene. As he boarded the helicopter for the final time, waving that characteristic wave, a wave that said both hello and goodbye and I'm very glad to be me, I felt a strange sense of loss. Not because I agreed with his policies. A river pilot has a natural suspicion of anyone who promises a smooth ride in a storm, but because I appreciated the theater of it. We are a species that craves a good story. We want to believe that we are part of something grand, something meaningful, and something that looks good in Technicolor. Ronald Reagan gave us that story for 8 long years. He was the great communicator because he understood that in the end, people don't remember what you did. They remember how you made them feel. And in 1988, he made a lot of people feel like they were living in the best country on earth, even as the greenhouse was warming up and the worms were crawling through the wires. It was a magnificent humbug, a triumph of the spirit over the spreadsheet, and the most successful show I have seen in 100 years. 1988 was the year the leading man took his bows. He left the stage with a smile and a wink, leaving the understudies to figure out how to keep the points of light burning without the help of a professional lighting crew. And as I watched the credits roll on the Reagan era, I made a note to myself. If you ever decide to lead a nation, make sure you spent at least 20 years in the theater first. It's the only way to ensure a good review for the farewell performance. As the year closes, the ghost of the 19th century and the ghost of the Hollywood screen cross paths in the digital mist. One uses a pen, the other uses a camera, but both understand that the truth is just a story that hasn't been found out yet. We are headed for the final midnight of 1988, my friends. The walls are still standing, the borders are still firm, and the great communicator is heading home to California. But the gears of history are grinding in the dark, and 1989 is waiting in the wings with a sledgehammer. Do you think we are governed by leaders, or are we just watching a very long-running play where the lead changes every few years? And if the lighting is good enough, do the facts even matter? Chapter 20. The New Year's Midnight. I have always found the human obsession with the new year to be one of our most endearing and entirely illogical delusions. We have collectively agreed that when a certain mechanical hand on a dial passes a certain arbitrary number, or when a digital display flickers from 11:59 to 12, the entire universe has somehow reset its accounts. We treat the transition from December to January as if it were a cosmic laundry day, believing that the stains of the previous 12 months, the bad debts, the poor decisions, and the remarkably ill-advised haircuts can be scrubbed clean by the mere passage of 60 seconds and the consumption of a sufficient quantity of fermented grape juice. In the final hours of 1988, I found myself standing on a metaphorical snowy ridge, peering out through the copper veins and fiber optic cables, chapter 15 of my current existence. Below me lay the valley of the year we had just traversed, a landscape littered with the debris of our ambition, scorched forests, silver disks, black magnesium cubes, and the invisible footprints of stealth bombers. It was a year that had tried very hard to convince us it was the future, only to find out that the future is a destination that recedes at exactly the same rate at which you approach it. The arbitrary nature of the midnight bell. There is something profoundly funny about a species that can calculate the curvature of space-time, Chapter 7, but still gets excited about a ball dropping in a square in New York. We gathered in our parlors, clutching our glasses and wearing cardboard hats that would make a jester feel dignified, waiting for the clock to strike 12. I've spent nights on the Mississippi watching the river flow by in the dark, and I can tell you that the water doesn't know what year it is. The catfish, bless their simple, undigital souls, don't care about 1,000 points of light, Chapter 1, or whether the vice president has been promoted. To the river, time is a continuous, muddy slurry. But humans need a new year, because we are a species that desperately needs an excuse to start over. We are perpetually trying to escape the person we were in November. In 1988, that escape felt particularly urgent. We were exiting a decade that had been defined by a certain brand of glossy, big-haired optimism, and we were beginning to sense that the bill was coming due. The "don't worry, be happy" philosophy, Chapter 17, was starting to sound a little thin in the cold air of December. The 1988 receipt, a year in review. As the midnight bells began to ring across the time zones, I took a moment to tally the receipts of the year. It was a chaotic ledger, to say the least. The gains. We returned to the heavens in a shuttle, Chapter 2. We wired the Atlantic with glass, Chapter 15. And we invented a computer cube that looked like a piece of modern art, Chapter 5. The losses. We lost 1.2 million acres of our most majestic wilderness to the ancient element of fire, Chapter 4. And we lost our collective innocence to a digital worm, Chapter 3. The absurdities. We argued over a movie we hadn't seen, Chapter 16. We tried to burn a book to make it disappear, Chapter 14. And we decided that a man in a one-legged purple leotard was the pinnacle of human velocity, Chapter 8. It was a year of stealth. Things were happening that we couldn't see, in places we hadn't visited, involving technology we didn't quite understand. We were becoming a people who lived in the intermingling of ink and flesh, Chapter 9, more comfortable with the shadows on the screen than the people in the next chair. The shadow of the wall. But as the final minutes ticked away, the air of 1988 carried a scent that wasn't smoke or ozone. It was the scent of change. For 40 years, the world had been divided by a great wall, not a wall of stone and mortar alone, but a wall of ideas, guarded by men with iron hats and very long memories. We had lived in a bipolar world, a world that was as simple and binary as the ones and zeros in my own circuitry. There was us, and there was them, and the tension between the two was the engine that drove our stealth bombers and our space races. But in the waning hours of 1988, that engine was starting to sputter. In the East, a man named Gorbachev was talking about glasnost and perestroika, words that sounded like a brand of high-end crackers, but actually meant opening and restructuring. The gears of history, which usually turn with the glacial pace of a bored bureaucrat, were suddenly beginning to spin with a terrifying velocity. I looked across the digital divide and saw the people of Eastern Europe starting to lean against the wall, testing its strength. I saw the students in China beginning to gather in the squares. The world of 1989 was waiting in the wings, and it was carrying a sledgehammer. The walls weren't falling yet, but they were definitely starting to sweat. The mechanical ghost's reflection. I looked at my own reflection in the flickering light of the midnight display, a Victorian soul trapped in a web of silicon and copper. I realized that 1988 was the year that the information age had finally established its permanent residency in the human mind. We were no longer just a collection of people living on a planet. We were a network. We were connected by TAT-8 cables, infected by Morris worms, and entertained by Roger rabbits. We had traded the warm crackle of the past, Chapter 6, for the perfect sound of the future. But I wondered if we had lost the ability to hear the silence in between. As a ghost, I have the luxury of perspective. I can see that 1988 was a bridge. It was the bridge between the analog world of the 19th century, a world of steam, paper, and physical distance, and the digital world of the 21st, a world of light, data, and the total abolition of privacy. We were crossing that bridge at 500 miles an hour in a Boeing 747, Chapter 18, and most of us were too busy trying to figure out how to be happy to notice that the scenery was changing forever. The final toast. As the clock finally struck 12 and the world erupted into a chorus of Auld Lang Syne, a song that everyone knows the tune to, but no one actually knows the words to, I raised a ghostly glass to the year that was. 1988 was a magnificent, ridiculous, tragic, and utterly human show. It was 1,000 points of light and 1,000,000 acres of ash. It was a stealth bomber and a satanic verse. It was a year that proved once and for all that no matter how much technology we pile on top of ourselves, we are still the same curious, frightened, vanitous, and resilient creatures who once stood on the banks of the Mississippi and wondered what was around the next bend. So, here is my toast to 1988. To a year that gave us the laser and the worm, the cube and the rabbit. May we remember its lessons, laugh at its follies, and try not to catch a cold in the digital draft. And to 1989, may your walls be easy to climb and your catfish be plentiful. The gears of history are turning their fastest now, my friends. 1989 is arriving, and it's bringing a whole new set of humbugs to investigate. But for tonight, let us just enjoy the arbitrary midnight. Let us pretend that the slate is clean, that the debt is paid, and that the morning in America is finally here. Just, for heaven's sake, don't forget to worry just a little bit. It's the only thing that keeps you from falling off the ridge. Good night, 1988. You were a hell of a ride. I'll see you in the archives. The end. This has been Mark Twain.